Chapter 281 Last Job. Chapter 281 Last Job. Sometime later, Sonny emerged from the ruins of the cathedral with a rucksack on his shoulder, took one last look back, and left. Whatever his future was going to be, he doubted that he would come back here any time soon. It was a bittersweet goodbye, cautiously walking through the familiar streets of the dark city, where he knew every turn and every piece of rubble, in this district of it, at least. Sonny kept his guard up. Many things must have changed in the months he had been away traveling through the labyrinth. The nightmare creatures he knew and, more importantly, knew how to avoid might have wandered away or perished, and new horrors might have taken their place. He had to stay prudent and careful. But still, his next and final goal was not that far away. As he sneaked toward it, Sonny thought about the Weaver's mask and the ways it could change his life. At first, he thought about simply never taking it off and walking around while delivering a deluge of lies. This way he would be safe from revealing his most guarded secret and becoming someone's slave, at least. But after considering this seriously, he came to the conclusion that it was not the best decision in his current circumstances. First of all, one couldn't be a part of any collective while lying all the time. Sonny had an unpleasant experience of being expelled from various groups for various reasons, and not being sincere and honest was one of the surest ways to make people want to avoid you at all cost, eventually, at least. And no one was able to survive alone in the dream realm. Not in a way that a person would want to live, anyway. Sonny knew a lot about this side of things, too, but most importantly, he was not going to be able to keep this lying for long, anyway. Not when dealing with people that already knew him. Kai and Cassie would notice the strange effect of the mask immediately. Kai because of his ability to sense lies, Cassie because her ability to see attributes would suddenly stop working. But others would catch on that something strange was going on with him pretty quickly, too, simply because of how drastic the change in his behavior would be. Especially Nephi's, who knew him so well. After that, they would inevitably have a lot of questions, and answering those questions, even with lies, would put him in more danger than he already was in. So sadly, Weaver's mask was not a panacea to Sonny's current situation. At best, it would be able to help him avoid certain predicaments if used sparingly, but really, he didn't want anyone to know that he was in possession of that memory at all. Sonny had to think of the future. If he was lucky enough to survive the fall of the Bright Castle and return to the real world, that was where the Black Mask could create miracles for him. It would allow him to have a hidden persona that was in no way connected to an awakened named Sunless, and as such, allow him to do and achieve things that would have been impossible or too dangerous to try as himself. To that effect, no one could know that the strange black wooden mask was connected to him, not even people whom he, somewhat, trusted, both for his own good and theirs. It is such a pity, though. It was. Just imagining Castor's face if he were to ever learn about what type of treasure Sonny had somehow found this time was tempting enough to change his plans. Castor. Sonny's face darkened. He had not forgotten about the promise Nephi's had made him at the start of their journey to the Hollow Mountains. Tomorrow, he was finally going to learn what was the deal with the Proud Legacy, and what exactly the relationship between Changing Star and him was. And how big were the chances of Sonny having to face Castor in battle. Despite all his dislike for the handsome scion of the Hanley clan, Sonny was reluctant to actually fight him. No matter how much progress he had made to get ready for the bloody conclusion of this disastrous chapter of his life, Castor was still not someone to be taken lightly. He was a tremendously deadly opponent just based on what Sonny knew about him, and there were secrets that the Legacy had been keeping, as well. That charm of his, what does it do? He was certain that he would defeat Castor if push came to shove. But the cost he would have to pay for that victory would be heavy, perhaps much more heavy than he was willing to pay. Suddenly uneasy, Sonny silently shook his head and continued on his way. As the sun began to roll toward the western horizon, he approached his goal, the ruins of an ancient library that stood lonesomely among the decimated buildings. Back near the end of his lonely months of hunting monsters on the streets of the Dark City, Sunny had begun exploring this ruin for bits of information about the history of the Forgotten Shore. Because of his chance encounter with the Stone Saint, and then with Kai, which led to him abandoning the ruins for a long expedition into the labyrinth, he had never finished this project. There was this one vast mosaic, in particular, that Sunny was interested in. It sprawled across the entire floor of the library's main hall and was mostly covered by rubble. In the past, Sunny was not strong enough to move the rubble out of the way. He had been hoping to make the Stone Saint do it for him, but sadly, the shadow was currently slumbering in the depths of his shadow core, evolving into whatever it was she was going to turn into. Just to be sure, he checked one more time to see if the mysterious process was still going, and sighed in disappointment. Luckily, he had grown much stronger himself during these months. Sunny was pretty sure that now, he would be able to clear the mosaic with his own 2 hands. It was just going to be a lot of work. Sending his shadow into the library to make sure that no abomination had made its nest there during his absence, Sunny entered its cool shadow of the ruin and sighed. Better get started. Soon. The scraping sound of heavy boulders being moved could be heard under the partially collapsed roof of the ancient building. Chapter 281-7 Heroes. Chapter 281-7 Heroes. In the depths of the night, Sunny was finally done with the arduous task of clearing the floor of the ruined library. Tiredly standing in the center of the circular hall, he found himself in the middle of a vast mural. The mosaic had endured the passage of time in an almost pristine condition. Most of it was preserved perfectly, with only a few small sections destroyed by corrosion or the ill will of the creature that inhabited the Crimson Spire. By now, Sunny was certain that it was the terror of the Forgotten Shore that had obliterated any depictions of the 7 heroes' faces. He didn't know how it was possible, but felt that the same furious force that had decapitated the ancient statues was responsible for the damage done to the engravings in the ancient mine and to this mural. It was as though the terror wanted to erase any sign of the founders of the Starlight Legion from history. Their names were forgotten, every person that had known of their stories turned into dust, and even the stones that bore their image were desecrated and shattered. How great the resentment that the evil creature harbored toward them must have been, for it to go to such lengths in its mad desire to obliterate their legacy. With a sigh, Sunny turned slightly and walked to the edge of the mural. He was searching for the start of its story. Depicted on the mural was not one image, but a long series of them, spiraling from the edges of the mosaic to its center like a long scroll. On them, the history of the land consumed by darkness was shown, ending with the coming of a new dawn. Sunny already knew what events had brought the curse of all-consuming darkness to the Forgotten Shore and how the ancient inhabitants of this land fought against all odds to resist it. Now, he was going to learn the final mystery, the reason for their eventual downfall. Finding the first image, he studied it and lingered for a bit. Then, he walked on, watching the history unfurl itself beneath his feet. As the curse subdued the world under the veil of everlasting darkness and terrible creatures started to attack the human settlements, one after another, mighty champions began to appear to battle them. But no matter how strong, brave, and valiant those champions were, none of them was able to resist for long, especially not when their own allies started turning into monsters. It was impossible to face the terrifying foes hiding in the darkness when no one was there to cover your back. Or even worse, if those you trusted the most to do so were the ones delivering a deadly blow instead. But still, humanity persisted. Months passed, then years. And eventually, a new generation grew up in this horrible world. Born in the all-consuming darkness, 7 valiant heroes gave an oath to return the light to the cursed land. Sunny whispered. Oh, the people who would later create the Starlight Legion were indeed born in the darkness. They never even saw the light that they would swear to bring back. All they knew of it were the tales their elders had told them, tales of a time when people never turned into nightmares, and the beautiful stars shone even in the darkest of nights. This new generation grew up surrounded by nothing but darkness and horror, and was forged by it into a far more fearsome force than their parents had ever been. Hard times created hard people, and their time was as unforgiving and harrowing as one could imagine. Beyond so, even. And so, the people it created adapted to match this dark reality. Eventually, 7 of them rose above the rest, each leading their faction in the constant battle against the encroaching doom. Sunny stopped and studied the image that showed all 7 of them. Even if their faces were damaged beyond recognition, there was a knight in an intricate plate armor forged of white metal, with a stalwart blade grasped firmly in his hands. Oh, a graceful priestess in a light flowing robe, her delicate hands shining with gentle light. A mighty hunter in an archaic cuirass leaning on a beautiful bronze spear. A masterful builder holding a mason's hammer in his calloused hands. A regal lord with a humble crown resting on his head, a single gem decorating its simple design. A subtle and merciless slayer with a ghostly stiletto hidden cunningly behind her back, and a stranger from a misty land who wore a stone-like armor and never showed his face, with a heavy round shield resting at his feet. Sunny looked at the 7 heroes, thinking. Knight, hunter, lord, stranger, slayer, builder, and priestess. Midnight shard, zenith shard, dawn shard, dusk shard, moonlight shard. And the other 2? Sunlight shard and starlight shard? The fate of the last 2 shard memories remained unknown to him. Nephice must have known something, though. Otherwise, she would not have ventured into the dangerous expedition to the Hollow Mountains to seek out the Crown of Dawn. Although the history of the Forgotten Shore was presented in more detail here, it did not give him any revelations yet. Thoughtful, Sunny turned away from the image of the 7 heroes and continued on. At some point in history, the heroes came together, created the Starlight Legion, and united the surviving remnants of humanity under its banner. It was also then when they gave their defiant oath. They must have been mad, weren't striving to achieve something impossible. The definition of madness? Sunny frowned, knowing full well that, in this case, the 7 heroes actually managed to fulfill their crazy ambition. It was all a little too close to home. He also knew someone who liked to set impossible goals and had an infuriating track record of proving them possible. But how did it all end? Yes, the heroes achieved their dream. But the Forgotten Shore still turned into a desolate hell. What happened to their light? Looking at the next images of the mosaic, Sunny got a feeling that he was about to find out. Chapter 282 Sacrifice. Chapter 282 Sacrifice. As Sunny walked in circles, drawing near to the center of the mosaic, he saw the depiction of various deeds that the Starlight Legion had achieved. The warriors led by the 7 heroes were truly a fearsome force. Forged and tempered by the relentless malice of their dark world and the unassailable will of their leaders, they drowned the Forgotten Shore in the blood of the cursed creatures. Even though many of them had turned into monsters themselves, especially those who had allowed themselves to falter in their conviction, the rest continued on, unbroken. Sunny couldn't tell how powerful exactly the members of the Legion were, but from some clues of their battles he guessed that they were at approximately the same level as the Awakened of his own world, at least at the beginning. With time, however, it seemed as though the warriors of the Cursed Land had grown much stronger. If most of the creatures they were fighting were of the corrupted rank, then that would put the Legion far above the humans back in the real world. Sunny wasn't sure if the 7 heroes and their soldiers were carriers of the nightmare spell, though, and if the same hierarchy of power could be applied to them. Eventually, the surviving humans migrated to the shore of the colossal impact crater and built an impregnable wall around their new city. This endeavor alone was so arduous and ambitious that he couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. Sunny slowed his steps. On the images in front of him, the construction of the Crimson Spire, no, it wasn't crimson yet back then, had begun. The Cyclopean Tower was built west of the city, reaching high into the sky like an axis of the world. Like a stairwell that was designed to allow humans to touch the heavens. This was what he was truly interested in. Sunny wanted to know what happened in the spire, how the artificial sun was created, and how the darkness that consumed this land was turned into a transient black sea. What he saw next made him falter, and then close his eyes with an expression of deep, exhausted resentment. In the second to last image, the 7 heroes were depicted standing apart in the 7 spots of the forgotten shore. In front of each of them, a crowd of thousands of people kneeled, waiting. Among those people were the warriors of the Legion and the civilians from the city, men and women, old and young. Each of the heroes held a weapon in their hands. Of course, this is what happened. What else would it be? A feeling of dark, bitter disappointment grasped his heart. Sunny didn't even know why he felt this way. It was not like he knew anything about the 7 heroes, really. But at some point, maybe because he needed to believe that there was a tiny glimmer of light in the vast and endless night, he had begun thinking of them as a symbol of the best humanity could be. What a foolish thought! He of all people should have known better. Curse you all! In the last image, one that took the center of the mosaic, 7 tall hills made of dead bodies surrounded the spire. Tens of thousands of people had been slaughtered, their blood flowing like rivers toward the dark tower. On top of each hill stood one of the valiant heroes, their hands stained red to the shoulder. As the last sacrifice, the slaughterers turned their weapons on themselves, thrusting them into their hearts. And somewhere out there, he knew, a tiny black seed floated in a pool of blood. Sunny grimaced in disgust. This was your dream? This is how you decided to bring back the light? You sick wretches! As the rivers of blood flowed to the spire, 7 streams of glowing crimson light moved above them and entered it from 7 directions. These streams represented the soul essence of numerous humans who had been sacrificed to create the artificial sun. But theirs wasn't the most terrible fate. In the center of the spire, a lone human figure was drawn, convulsing in harrowing agony as the raging storm of soul energy entered her body. The conflux of all that power, the sacrificial vessel meant to be its conduit. The anchor of the sun. Sunny recognized that figure too. To him, the features of her face were painfully familiar. It was the same face as that of the nameless goddess whose statue stood in the ruined cathedral. The crimson light entered her body and shot from her screaming mouth and eyes upward, pure and white. It rose to the height of the spire, where a new sun was being born. Frightened by its light, the darkness retreated underground, where it was locked behind 7 seals that were left behind by the heroes as their last deed. The rest was easy to deduce. After the heroes perished to create the artificial sun, everything was fine for a while. But then, maybe after a few decades, or even hundreds of years, the light of the sun began to dim. So the people of the Dark City had to make a new sacrifice. Perhaps, the second time, only 7 people had been killed to renew the power of the spire. But then it happened again, and that time, 7 was not enough. So they sacrificed 14. And when it happened again, they sacrificed a few dozen. And eventually, hundreds of people were being slaughtered every year to keep the sun burning. Because of the simple fact that the 7 heroes and their people, all of them had terribly mighty souls. But their descendants, who didn't have to grow up in utter darkness and fight terrible monsters to live through the day, did not. And at some point in this vicious cycle, the vessel that had been imprisoned in the spire and served as the anchor for the bloodthirsty sun was corrupted. Whatever kind of conscience it had left had been completely shattered. The nameless goddess of the Dark City became the crimson terror of the forgotten shore. All that pain, all that rage, all that blood exploded from the spire and infected the very land itself, growing into an endless labyrinth of the strange crimson coral. The 7 seals came undone, releasing that darkness that had been imprisoned underground for hundreds of years. This was what Cassie had seen in the vision. The darkness and the fury of the newborn terror fell on the humans of the Dark City like a tide and wiped them all out, erasing even the memory of them from the face of the world. This was how the Forgotten Shore was born. Chapter 283 Final Piece of the Puzzle. Chapter 283 Final Piece of the Puzzle. So this is how it is. Sunny stared at the last image of the mosaic, a dark and resentful expression frozen on his face. Depicted in the center of the mural, a sun fueled by blood shone on the mountains formed by dead bodies. Tens of thousands of people had been slaughtered to create it, and thousands more must have been butchered later on to keep it burning in the indifferent sky. The first sacrifices had died willingly, lured into submission by their fanatical rulers. What about those who came after? Somehow, Sunny doubted it, and for what? How did it all end? The 7 seals had been broken, and the ancient civilization had been obliterated. But the sun created and nurtured by it was not destroyed, just corrupted. It still rose in the morning and fell beyond the horizon after the dusk, illuminating the desolate hell of its own creation. As long as its vessel, the terror of the Crimson Spire, existed at the center of the labyrinth, it would continue to shine in the cold gray skies. And as long as it did, the darkness that had escaped its underground prison and turned into the cursed sea was going to continue coming and going, scared of its light. Great. The two deserve each other. He didn't know why the all-consuming darkness had become a literal sea of impenetrably black water, but had a guess or two. Either hundreds of years spent locked away behind the seals had affected it that way, or the artificial sun had. The terror had been changed by the curse, so why couldn't the curse be changed by the terror in return? Why wasn't that sun extinguished, though? There was no one alive on the forgotten shore to make sacrifices to the spire anymore, but Sunny suspected that there was a reason for why the crimson coral seemed to grow either out of or toward bones. If he was right, the whole labyrinth was a giant maw with which the terror absorbed the soul essence of every creature that bled on the coral before it died. It was all a part of its body. Sunny shivered, realizing that both the labyrinth and the dark sea were, in fact, colossal living creatures. It was just that the scale of them was so boundless that they seemed like forces of nature. Compared to the eternal struggle of the two titanic beings, the struggle of a handful of tiny humans was nothing short of insignificant. Or was it? Suddenly he frowned. What about Nephi's and her plan? How did the shard memories come into all of this? At first, a dark thought entered his mind. He imagined that Changing Star was preparing a mass sacrifice of her own, a hecatomb to appease the Crimson Terror. The number of the sleepers being sent to the Forgotten Shore each year was too eerily similar to the number of sacrifices made to the Crimson Spire by the inhabitants of the Dark City to be a simple coincidence. But he quickly dismissed that thought. After all, the sacrifices were meant to renew the power of the Blood Sun, and that was not Neph's goal. If anything, she meant to destroy it once and for all to gain entry to the gateway hidden in the spire. So, what did it all mean? Sunny scowled, remembering every piece of information about the 7 heroes and their cursed land he knew. And most importantly, those that came directly from the spell. After a while, he muttered, "Time has erased their names and their faces, but the memory of the defiant oath still remains." This was the second part of the description that the spell had given the Starlight Legion armor. His eyes widened. All this time, he thought that this sentence simply meant that the legacy of the 7 heroes lived on even after their deaths. But now, he suddenly realized that the truth might have been far more straightforward. The key to understanding the secret of the shard memories was right in front of him this whole time. In fact, it came from the first memory he had ever gotten on the Forgotten Shore, the Azure Blade. "On this Forgotten Shore, only steel remembers," he whispered, a sudden understanding dawning on him like a revelation. The memory of the defiant oath remained, and only steel remembered. Sunny rubbed his face. "I am such a fool." Everything he needed to learn the truth had been at his disposal from the very start of it all. The heroes were long gone, but their terrible oath was still here, preserved in cold steel. It was not the memory of it that remained, but the memory. The shards were that memory. Of course. It all makes so much sense now. But then, what was their purpose and why was Nephi so motivated to find each one? That was easy to guess, too. Cassie had basically told him, all those months ago. "In the end, I saw a colossal, terrifying Crimson Spire. At its base, 7 severed heads were guarding 7 locks. In its fury, the terror of the Crimson Spire had beheaded the statues of its creators and brought their heads as trophies to guard the entrance to its lair, where Cassie had seen them, as well as 7 mysterious locks. What did a lock need? A key. All locks required a key to either open them or shut them closed. Sunny slowly exhaled. The 7 seals that kept the all-consuming darkness locked underground came undone, but they weren't destroyed. If one had all the keys, it was still possible to seal the curse once again. That was what the 7 heroes had left behind, and with the cursed darkness locked away, the spire would lose its most deadly line of defense. Finally, everything became clear. Sunny remained motionless for a long time, looking at the bloody images beneath his feet. After a while, he sighed and turned away. There was a bitter taste in his mouth. Sick. I am sick of this place. So sick of all of this. Cassie's vision showed her fire and rivers of blood. Good. It could all burn to the ground. He didn't care anymore. Chapter 284 Nothing Serious. Chapter 284 Nothing serious. In the cold light of dawn, Sunny approached the spot where the other members of the cohort, and he agreed to meet. The Shadow had already located their camp in the ruin of an ancient building and was currently watching them, hidden in the darkness. The 5 youths were busy preparing for the last stretch of the way to the Bright Castle. They were calm and collected, not at all like people who were about to face the horrifying wrath of the Bright Lord. What kind of horror had they not faced already? Climbing over the rubble, Sunny let Nephi and the rest know of his approach and jumped down. Landing just a few meters away from the group, he straightened his back and gave them an indifferent look. Hey! They greeted him in a reserved manner. A palpable tension permeated the air, making everyone reluctant to speak too much. Only Effie was seemingly unaffected by this dark mood. Leaning on a stone wall, the huntress was enthusiastically gnawing on a juicy bone. Her white teeth were effortlessly crushing it into tiny pieces, which were then chewed and swallowed along with the marrow. Noticing Sunny, she smiled. Hey, doofus! He gave her a nod and wanted to turn away, but then noticed a slight frown that appeared on Effie's face. Looking at him with a bit of uncertainty, she asked, You all right? Sunny was silent for a few moments, then smiled. Finally, he said in an even tone, I'm perfect. Leaving the doubtful huntress behind, he walked past Castor and approached Nephi. The changing star was standing with her back to the group, looking up at the silhouette of the bright castle that loomed in the distance. Hearing his steps, she turned around. The gentle light of dawn reflected in her eyes, making them appear to shine. You've made it, Sunny. I am glad. He shrugged. Why? You didn't expect me to show up? She was silent for a while, and then looked away. A lock of silver hair fell on her eyes. Nephi tucked it behind her ear and sighed. Could I not? It's not like I know the future. After that, she smiled, amusing. In the 11 months they had spent on the forgotten shore, this was only the second time Sunny heard Changing Star tell a joke, and the first time it was actually funny. If a little macabre. But what was the harm in indulging in a bit of dark humor? At this point, Sunny did not return the smile, however. Glancing in the direction of the Bright Castle, he asked, So, what's the plan? Nephi shrugged. This time there is no plan. We have confirmed that Gunlog is still pretending to be looking for Effie to bring her to justice for killing the missing guards. Once we enter the outer settlement, the members of the host will come for her. Then I will most likely be forced to challenge him. We'll see after that. Sunny looked at her with a dark expression. Pretty much exactly what I expected. He didn't hesitate to ask. Can you really break his armor? Even with the Dawn Shard, your sword is barely equal to an ascended memory. And that thing is a true transcended echo. She lingered for a while before answering. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm and even. I don't have to break the armor. I just have to break the man. Sunny shook his head with a humorless smile. Good luck achieving one without the other. He paused for a moment, and then said without a hint of levity in his voice. Anyway, you owe me a conversation. Changing Star glanced at him, then nodded. All right. But not here. With that, she gave the others a sign to wait and walked away. Sunny followed. His shadow stayed, making sure that no one was going to try and eavesdrop on them. It was staring directly at Castor, following his every move with intense attention. As they walking, Sonny suddenly said, "By the way, I have something to tell to you, too." Nephi glanced at him and slightly raised an eyebrow. "Yes? What is it?" Sonny was silent for a bit. Then he smiled. "Oh, it's nothing serious. Do you remember a guy called Harper?" She frowned, then shook her head. "Should I? Who is he?" Sonny shrugged. His expression remained neutral. "Just the guy that I killed. He was one of Gunlog's spies." Neff looked at him for a few moments, then asked with indifferent confusion, "What about him?" A slight shadow ran over Sonny's face. However, his smile remained exactly the same. "No, nothing. Just wondered if you knew him." When they walked far enough and were concealed from the eyes of the cohort by several tall walls, Changing Star stopped and turned to face him. Looking at Sonny, she said, "It is good that we can speak privately. Actually, I wanted to ask you a favor." He blinked. "Well, that is unexpected." "What is it?" She hesitated for a few moments. "After my fight with Gunalug is over, if, when I win, I might not be in the best shape. Even if I am, there will be a flood of soul essence pouring into my body. It will incapacitate me for a bit." The changes that happened to the body after a small portion of soul essence was consumed were subtle, but in large quantities, it could be disorienting, sometimes even debilitating for a short while. Sometimes, experiencing these changes and getting used to them took a little time. Sonny tilted his head. A flood of soul essence? What does it matter if her core is either full to the brim, or at least almost saturated? He frowned, trying to guess what he wanted from him. "So what do you need me to do? Keep Haruz busy while you recover?" She shook her head, then looked away. A light sigh escaped from Changing Star's lips. "No. I want you to make sure that Castor is nowhere near me when that happens." Here it was. The truth was about to come out. Sonny stared at Nephi, his expression cold and dark. After a few moments of tense silence, he asked, "Why? What's the deal with you and Castor?" She looked at him, her striking gray eyes calm and deep. Then she said, "It's very simple, really. Castor has been sent here to kill me." Chapter 285 Kill Order. Chapter 285 Kill Order. Sonny remained silent for a few moments. Finally, it became clear that Nephi wasn't going to continue. Feeling a slight sense of exasperation, he asked, "Why would Castor want to kill you?" Despite the calm appearance, there was a tempest raging in his mind. The revelation of Castor's true intention had shaken Sonny. Yes, he disliked the proud legacy, and yes, their dynamic with Changing Star had always been a bit strange. But he never expected to hear something like this. In his mind, Castor was more of an opportunist with distasteful ambitions, most likely having to do with the purity of his clan's bloodline, than a cold-blooded killer. In what world did him wishing to kill Nephi made any sense? He was her #1 fan. The only logical explanation Sonny could find was that the proud scion had been secretly working for Gunlog all along. But then, that theory also didn't hold when subjected to a close inspection. The Bright Lord was determined to kill Changing Star with his own 2 hands and in front of hundreds of people. What would he need Castor for? Nephi lingered for a bit, then shrugged. "People have been trying to kill me for as long as I can remember. Have you forgotten?" Sonny slowly shook his head. No, I did not. But what does that have to do with Castor?" She smiled. "They were not going to stop just because I came of age, survived my first nightmare, and was sent into the dream realm. If anything, that would have been the perfect opportunity to finally make me disappear forever. Sleepers enter this cursed world alone, away from the protections of society and whatever allies they might have in the real one. Do you see?" He gave her a nod, his expression growing dark. Indeed, no one was as vulnerable as young sleepers entering the dream realm for the first time. Nephi sighed and looked away. In any case, when I enrolled into the academy, I knew that someone among our classmates had to have received orders to make sure that I never returned from the dream realm. I just didn't know who it was. Suddenly, she glanced at him. The corner of her lips curled upward. Actually, for a long time, I thought that it was you. Sunny blinked and stared at her in disbelief. What? Me? Are you CR? Actually, never mind. What exactly about me made you think that I'm an agent of some secret legacy cabal? Do I look like a legacy to you? Nephi calmly looked him in the eye. Honestly? Not any legacy that I know. But there were too many things about you that didn't make sense. He frowned. Do tell. She slowly raised her hand, then began counting on her fingers. Let's see, you claim to be an orphan from the outskirts, but somehow managed to survive both the first nightmare and the arrival on the Forgotten Shore. You didn't consume any soul shards, but kept growing more powerful. You said that you had never held a sword in your hand, but absorbed my lessons with astonishing speed. And finally, every other word you said was a lie, especially when it came to your origins, your past, your strength, and your aspect. Running out of fingers on one hand, she made a fist and pointed to it. Need I continue? Sunny cleared his throat. No, well, when you put it like this. She smiled and shook her hand, then lowered it. But after some time, I realized that my suspicions about you were wrong. If you were really tasked with killing me, you could have just left me on the Ashen Barrow. Back then, I was as good as dead. But you didn't. In fact, you risked a lot to take both Cassie and me with you. The smile slowly disappeared from her face. So when we reached the bright castle and Castor immediately appeared, insinuating his way into my inner circle, I knew pretty much instantly that it was him. Sunny frowned. Aren't you getting ahead of yourself? Don't get me wrong, I'm the last person in this world who would want to defend that pompous bastard, but there were hundreds of sleepers in our crop, and out of those, only 7 were sent to the Forgotten Shore. And only 4 lived long enough to see the castle. What are the chances that the person with orders to make you vanish was among them? Isn't it a bit too big of a coincidence? Changing Star slowly shook her head. Who said it was a coincidence? People often tend to forget that the spell has a mind of its own. It sees all and hears all. And it really loves to play with fate. If there was someone among those hundreds of people tasked with killing me, the chances of me having a fateful encounter with them in the dream realm would be all but guaranteed. That is how the spell always does things. Sunny had to agree. The spell, indeed, loved to play with fate. His whole damn life was proof of that. Meanwhile, Nephi continued. Of course, despite my suspicions, I wasn't sure at first. But the more I observed Castor, the more convinced I became that I was right. He did everything in his power to get close to me, and then tried his hardest to subtly isolate me from everyone I could have trusted. He spent his time studying my every move, while keeping his secrets close to his chest. It's him. I've been sure of it for a long time. Sunny tilted his head, trying to digest this new information. After a while, he asked, if Castor wanted to kill you, why hasn't he made a move to kill you yet? She lingered for a bit, then smiled slightly. Because among all of the humans on the Forgotten Shore, he knows what the scions of the Immortal Flame clan are capable of the best. Isn't it ironic? He respects my ability too much to be careless, maybe even fears it. And he can't allow himself to fail. His honor won't allow it. So, Castor won't attack until he is absolutely sure that I won't be able to resist. He'll make his move when I have no chance to escape. Sunny scratched the back of his head. Let me rephrase that. If Castor wants to kill you, why is he still alive? Why didn't you kill him already? He was sure that if Nephi wanted to, the proud legacy would have been dead a long time ago. Changing Star hesitated, and then said in an even tone, because I need him for what is to come. It doesn't matter that he intends to betray me. Traitor or not, he is of use. Chapter 286 Blessings of the Fire. Chapter 286 Blessings of the Fire. Sometime later, the six of them left the secluded ruin and made their way toward the bright castle. The dark city was silent and bleak, its streets devoid of life and movement. Even the nightmare creatures seemed to remain hidden in the lairs today, as though the tension that hung in the air like a harbinger of a disastrous change. A lonely star was about to ignite in the sky above the cursed city. Nephi's was the first one to walk under the marble arch and step on the road that led to the outer settlement. Her face was calm and motionless, any hint of emotion hidden behind her usual mask of indifference. It was as though she was returning home in triumph, not marching to her own execution. There was a slightly distant look in her eyes. Sonny abandoned his usual position at the back of the group and was now walking side by side with her. Maybe it was just a whim, but he felt unwilling to follow in her footsteps as he had always done before. From the first day they met as they ascended the tall hill, Changing Star suddenly asked, "Sonny, do you remember your first nightmare well?" Her voice sounded relaxed and idle. He cast a sideways glance at her and hesitated for a few moments. Then, he answered in an even tone, "Like it was yesterday." She smiled slightly. "Was it hard?" Slowly, a grin appeared on his face. "Hard? No, not hard. Impossible. It was a ghastly, despicable, and torturous ordeal. Truly the stuff of nightmares. Calling it hard would be an injustice." With a dismissive shrug, Sonny drove the memories of the Black Mountain away and asked, "What about yours?" Nephi looked away, remembering. After a while she said, "Mine wasn't that bad, actually." He stared at her in disbelief. "What, you only had to kill a measly 1,000 unholy titans with your bare hands, or something like that? Knowing you, not that bad, means that it was nothing short of a true horror show." She slowly shook her head. "No. I mean it. I didn't have to fight anyone, really. Up until the very end." Sonny blinked. "Wait, seriously?" A strangely sad smile appeared on her lips. "In my first nightmare, I was the daughter of a lighthouse keeper. My family lived in a beautiful tower on the shore of a beautiful sea. Every morning the warm sun rose from beyond the horizon, bathing the endless expanse of azure waves in beautiful light. The winds were gentle and the world was kind. It was me, my parents, and my younger siblings. We lived together in harmony, humbly but needing for nothing." He frowned. "And then what? A sea serpent destroyed the lighthouse? Some rotten horror rose from the depths?" Changing Star's eyes became distant. A few moments passed before she spoke again. "No. Nothing happened. That was the point of it, I think. My nightmare, it was actually a paradise. It was everything I dreamed about when I was a little kid. Only much more wondrous and human than I could have ever imagined." Sonny looked at her in utter shock. As he watched, the hint of sorrow disappeared from Neff's face, replaced by a subtly harsh expression. "But that was what made it so hard to overcome. Impossible, even. Just like you said. Because all I had to do to conquer the nightmare, all I had to do was to walk away and leave it all behind. Knowing that I could just stay there, in that paradise. Forever." He hesitated for a while, then asked cautiously, "So what did you do?" A heavy sigh escaped from Neff's lips. Her eyes grew dim. "I searched for a way out of the nightmare for a long time. But no matter how hard I looked, there wasn't any. Day after day, night after night, as time went by, it became harder and harder to force myself to continue searching. I grew accustomed to that bliss, that warm and beautiful life. And eventually, a day came when I thought that maybe I should stop. Maybe I can just stay." She tilted her head slightly and said, her tantalizing voice reaching the deepest, darkest parts of his heart, "That was the day I went to the top of the lighthouse. You see, Sonny, you have to light yourself on fire, to rip the blessings of the fire. That was what my grandmother used to say. So that was what I did. I doused myself in oil, and set myself aflame. The white flames suddenly licked her hands, and she stared at them, her face slowly turning pale, her eyes reflecting the terrible agony she felt. As her ivory skin continuously boiled, darkened, and then healed to become pristine again, she said simply, "And I burned." Suddenly, the flames disappeared, and she made a fist. Her voice grew a little strained. "And after a long, long time, when all of it was over, I found myself in a dark cave, nestled in a slimy cocoon of black silk. All around me, thousands upon thousands of people were sleeping in similar cocoons with their eyes open, with happy smiles on their empty faces. And above us was a creature so revolting and abhorrent that I can't bring myself to describe it to this day. It was feeding on our dreams." She grew quiet for a bit, and then added, "That creature was convulsing in pain, as though it shared in the agony I felt, too. Somehow, I managed to break free of the cocoon and kill it before it fully regained its senses." She glanced at him and smiled. However, there was no warmth in that smile. "That was how I conquered my first nightmare." Sonny looked her in the eyes for a long time, silent. Then, he slowly turned away. "Just as I said, the stuff of nightmares. I guess we call them that for a reason." Changing Star laughed. "I guess. But really, fighting that terror wasn't the hardest part. Waking up trapped in a repulsive cocoon wasn't the hardest part. Even burning alive wasn't the hardest part." She grew silent for a few moments and then said, looking at the white road beneath their feet, "The hardest part was walking up the steps to the top of the lighthouse. Not because of what waited for me in the future, but because of what I was leaving in the past." Soon, the familiar shapes of the outer settlement appeared in their sight. They had finally returned to the bright castle. Chapter 287 Lonely Star. Chapter 287 Lonely Star. The outer settlement had changed from the time Sonny saw it last. At the point where the white road widened into the vast platform that the settlement stood upon, a tall stone barricade was built, with watchful sentries observing the approach to the crest of the hill. Each of them was wielding a memory weapon and a sturdy armor, their faces full of dark determination. The makeshift watchtower constructed on the roof of Neff's lodge loomed above them, with several archers ready to rain arrows on any nightmare creature that wandered close. The slum itself was much the same, but the people populating it seemed different. Many of them were bruised and bandaged, but their eyes shone with the subtle light of hope that wasn't there or as strong before. That hope was contrasted against the suffocating feeling of tension that hung in the air. From time to time, someone would glance toward the castle and frown, a dark expression appearing on their face. There was another detail that surprised Sonny. On the sleeves of many slum dwellers, a piece of pure white cloth was tied, as if announcing their allegiance to some god or goddess. There had been none of that when he left this place a few months ago. There were also graffiti drawn on the walls of the most derelict hovels, some of them depicting a shining star, some the image of a beautiful bronze spear. What is that all about? The white armbands and the star were, obviously, meant to represent Nephi's. But when had Effie suddenly become an apostle? Glancing at the voracious huntress, he raised an eyebrow. "Anything you want to tell me?" She scratched the back of her head, then shrugged. "I've become a bit of a folk hero, apparently." Sonny shook his head and didn't press the issue. Whatever. When the sentries saw who was approaching, their faces first became shocked, and then lighted up with intense jubilation. "Lady Nephis! It's Changing Star! Lady Nephis has returned! She is alive!" The hum of voices spread through the entire settlement in an instant. If Gunlog had not known that they were back in the Dark City, he would have learned of it now. But he knew, of course. He knew it long before the people of the slum ever laid their eyes on their supposed savior. Sonny looked past the outer settlement, at the mighty walls of the bright castle. How long before its lord throws them a welcome party? Soon, the cohort was surrounded by a crowd of exhilarated people. Everyone wanted to see that St. Nephis was alive and well with their own eyes. The other members were bathing in attention, too. Especially Effie. "Effie! Huntress Athena! Welcome home, Effie! Show them!" The huntress grinned in bewilderment, and kept quiet. In the crowd, there were a few faces that did not share in everyone's joy. They were the leaders of the outer settlement's hunting parties. The gazes they threw at Nephi's were grim and full of meaning. She gave them a nod, letting the experienced hunters know that she understood the message they were trying to relay. Then, Changing Star faced the inhabitants of the slum and took the bag that Effie handed her. Slowly unclasping it, she spoke, her calm voice effortlessly making the crowd grow silent. "I am not good with words, so please accept my gratitude, dreamers of the Dark City. The past few months have been harsh on me and the members of my cohort, but they must have been equally as harsh on you. However, we have persevered. You here in these cursed ruins, and we out there in the ghastly depths of the labyrinth. But all of it was not in vain." With that, she took something from the bag and tossed it to the ground. Suddenly, a deathly silence settled over the crowd. Everyone was staring at the object laying on the stones, expressions of fear clearly written on many faces. It was a terrifying, jagged black talon, which was as sharp and long as a sword, and then another one fell near it, and another, and another. Eventually, 38 of these dark blades lay in a pile in front of Nephi's, 30 from the 6 front limbs of the spire messenger, and 8 from the 2 hind ones. Closing the bag, Nephi put it on her shoulder and said, her tone dark and piercing, "Out there in the labyrinth, we have fought and slew one of the cursed messengers of the Crimson Spire. I bring you its claws as a gift, to become your weapons." Stunned whispers ran through the crowd. The messengers were both a symbol of terror and a symbol of hope to the people of the Dark City. Terror because of their horrifying power and appetite, as well as their connection to the dreaded spire, and hope because of the legends that once, a long time ago, a group of powerful sleepers had managed to kill one. And now, the legend came alive right in front of their eyes. Nephi lingered for a moment, and then sighed, a somber note appearing in her voice. "Many years ago, we, those who were sent to the Forgotten Shore, weren't yet imprisoned by fear. Enthralled by the sin of those cowards who had forgotten that they are, first and forever, humans. Back then, there were people among us willing to risk their lives to conquer this hell. Escape it. The First Lord and his companions were the greatest of them. And now..." Brilliant sparks of light suddenly appeared around her head like a sacred halo. Changing Star's eyes shined with pure white radiance, and, as the crown of dawn weaved itself from light and fell upon her head, she spoke. She didn't rise or even strain her voice, but the impact of her words only grew because of it. "I have brought his legacy back to the Dark City. This is the crown of the First Lord. We have retrieved it from a place of eternal darkness where he had fallen in battle. He died trying to find a way out of this cursed land for all of us to follow." She paused for a moment and then said, her face illuminated by the brilliant white flames that burned in her furious eyes. On her forehead, the single gem decorating the dawn shard shone with that brilliance, too, almost like a third eye. "And with it, we will finish what he started." Chapter 288 Progress Report. Chapter 288 Progress Report. Sometime later, they entered the stone lodge and found themselves in the middle of another, smaller crowd. Around 30 or 40 people gathered in the main hall of Changing Star's dwelling, making it look even smaller than it had before. However, these were not just any sleepers from the slum. Most of them were experienced fighters from the outer settlement few hunting parties, as well as people who Nephi had recruited into her faction during her time in the Dark City. Back when Sunny had been a part of the group, they were weak and hopeless young men and women who were barely surviving in the cruel reality of the Forgotten Shore. Now, things changed. Neff's little helpers were armed with makeshift weapons and wearing armors fashioned from a wide variety of scavenged materials, while some were even in possession of memories. They also held themselves very differently from before. Honestly, the difference between them and the hunters was not that big now. If Sunny didn't know which were which, he might have mistaken one for the other. Changing Star walked through the crowd and approached the window that opened on the bleak view of the cursed ruins. She looked at it for a short moment, and then turned around, a dark expression on her face. "Tell me." The leaders of the hunting parties glanced at each other. One of them, a stocky young man with long messy hair and 3 ugly scars running all the way from his forehead to his chin, spoke with a bit of uncertainty. "Welcome back, Lady Nephis. It is good that you are alive and well." She gave him a nod. The hunter paused, then continued, his voice somber. "We, have followed your orders and advice for these past months. The militia you created has been reinforced and organized to protect the settlement from the attacking monsters. With the memories you and your cohort hunted for us in the ruins, the casualties were low both among the watchmen and among the civilians. Compared to before, I mean." Changing Star remained silent and just stared at him. The young man sighed. "About the other thing, it went almost exactly how you told us it would. Members of the host came into the settlement shortly after your departure, demanding that Effie surrendered herself to be judged for the disappearance of those guards. When we told them that she was gone, they got violent. Several people were injured, but no one died." Effie scoffed. The hunted gave her a complicated look and scratched his cheek. "After that, they would come again every week or so, hurt a few people and break things, always with the same demand. But we kept our cool and just, well, took it. Like you told us to do. That seemed to only make them angrier, but they had no real reason to escalate things. In the end, they just settled for making our lives difficult and pushing people around." The tall huntress shook her head. "What's with the people foaming at their mouths to greet me? What's that really about?" The young man looked down in embarrassment and cleared his throat. Well, you see, the more the castle proclaimed that you have to answer for the murder of those guards, the more people in the settlement became, how do I say this, appreciative of you." Effie looked at him with a perplexed expression. "Because I am being unjustly accused?" He smiled sheepishly. No. Actually, the opposite. They really appreciate the fact that you had, allegedly, killed 6 guards. In fact, their only regret is that you didn't kill more. There are tales about how exactly you dealt with them, too, one more colorful than the other. The most popular one is that, the guards wanted to rob you of your honor, so that's why you had to teach the castle folks a lesson." The tall huntress blinked. "My honor? Since when do I have honor?" The young man grinned. "Hey, don't look at me. I did not come up with this one, all right? Blaine Park, it was his idea." Effie looked darkly at another hunter, who just shrugged. "Lady Nephis told us to do our best to make people in the settlement root for you. It worked, did it not?" The unruly huntress rubbed her face with an exasperated expression. "But I didn't kill them, though." The hunter looked at her with no humor in his eyes. "Who cares?" Effie opened her mouth to say something, but Nephis interrupted her. "Time is short. Don't waste it on useless chatter." Then she turned to the hunter with scars on his face and asked, "What about my last instruction?" He frowned, then took out a small wooden box from a leather pouch tied to his belt. The young man held the little box like it was the most terrible nightmare creature. Handling it with extreme caution, he approached Nephis and handed it to her. There were drops of sweat on his forehead. "This is what the person from the castle brought. I don't know what they used to make Hyde create that thing, but the result was exactly as you wished, at least according to the note they left." He hesitated. "The box and the note simply appeared on my pillow one day. I almost died of a heart attack when I read what that thing is supposed to be." Sonny stared at the box with interest. Hyde was one of Gunlog's lieutenants, a young woman in charge of the artisans. Her aspect ability allowed her to manipulate certain qualities of plants, which was of tremendous use here on the Forgotten Shore, where the food was scarce and monotonous. But what could Nephis want from her that was so important? And why was the hunter so scared of the little box? Carefully taking it, Changing Star looked at the box for a few moments, and then handed it to Castor. You know what to do. With a short nod, Castor walked toward the door and disappeared. Nephi's, meanwhile, turned to the hunters and said in a steady tone, You did well. Thank you all. As wide smiles appeared on their faces, she took Effie's bottomless bag and opened it once again. Turning the bag upside down, Changing Star said, This is not a reward, nor is it a gift. This is just something that all of you deserve, and going to need very soon. A moment later, a river of glimmering crystals flowed from the bag, scattering on the table's surface. There were hundreds and hundreds of them, each shining with subtle, alluring light. Soon, the crystals spilled over the edges of the table and fell to the floor. A few moments later, more than 1,000 soul shards appeared before the stunned people who were gathered in the room. The bottomless bag finally ran empty. Sunny stared at the tall pile of shining crystals and sighed. Back before all of this had started, he had a pile like that of his own, only much, much smaller. His pride and joy.it was all gone now, sadly. What a sight! And I thought I was rich. Chapter 289 Start of the Play. Chapter 289 Start of the Play. Back in the labyrinth, Sunny wasn't the only one who had killed countless nightmare creatures. In fact, due to his primary role as a scout, the three main fighters of the cohort had killed many more. He knew for a fact that at least two of them, Effie and Castor, had fully saturated their soul cores long before their return journey was finished. Absorbing any more shards would have been useless for them. At some point, Nephis had begun to abstain from consuming her share of the spoils, too, added with the shards that Sunny traded for the unwanted memories that the members of the cohort had accumulated. A truly incredible amount of the alluring crystals had been placed into Effie's leather bag. He had often wondered what Nephis would use them for, and now, he had his answer. The people gathered in the main hall of the hunting lodge, her most trusted subordinates, stared at the tall pile of soul shards in utter shock. Here in the Dark City, this was an inconceivable wealth. One shard was enough to buy a person a week of food, comfort, and safety behind the tall walls of the bright castle. Too many had died because they lacked these things. So, in a sense, the mountain of crystals in front of them was tantamount to 1,000 human lives. The scarred hunter slowly tore his eyes away from the glittering shards and looked at Changing Star, his face pale and his voice suddenly raspy. What is this, Lady Nephis? She remained silent for a few moments, and then said in her even, reserved, strangely affecting voice, This is for you. To nourish yourselves and grow stronger. You are going to need every bit of strength for what awaits us in the days to come. The young man watched her, a dangerous flame slowly igniting in his eyes. A flame of resolve, adoration, almost worship. Hidden in a shadowy corner, Sunny smiled with dark apprehension. Back at the start of it all, he had told Nephis that Gunlog could not be defeated because he controlled every facet of life here in the Dark City: food, safety, hope and fear, even power itself. Then, he had watched as she gave the people of the outer settlement free food, placed them under the protection of her sword, and ignited the embers of the long-forgotten hope in their hearts. All that remained was power, and now, she had brought them power as well. And no wonder they were ready to worship her. In their eyes, Changing Star was a noble savior. No one knew that their Messiah was a counterfeit one. Glancing at the stunned people, Effie sighed and took her bag from Neff's hands. Looking inside the empty memory with a bit of a sad expression, she said, What are you waiting for? Gunlog's men are probably already arming themselves to come here and break your thick skulls. Share the shards among yourselves and absorb them, dimwits. The sleepers did not make her say it twice. *****. Not long after the last shard had been absorbed, one of the watchers ran into the room, breathing heavily. Coming! They are coming! There was a hint of unrestrained fear in her voice. Sunny flexed his shoulders and stretched. The show is about to start. The people gathered in the room glanced at each other, their faces full of tension. Only Nephi's remained indifferent, watching out of the window at the dead city that sprawled below her like a desolate, lonesome graveyard. Stay calm, everyone. Her voice settled them down. The hunter with scars on his face turned to Changing Star, a deep frown on his face. After hesitating for a few moments, he said, Bud, they are coming to take Effie. We can't allow that to happen. I'm done watching good people be taken into the damn castle and never return. If they want to make an example out of her, like they did with Jubai, over my dead body. The hum of angry voices rose in the hall, accompanied by heated glares. Exactly. They will pay for Jubai's death. Your dead body? Why not their dead bodies? Nephis lingered for a moment, then turned to them. A slight smile appeared on her face. Don't worry. Nothing is going to happen to Effie. You have my word. That seemed to calm them down a little. It seemed as though they were willing to believe anything she said, regardless of how impossible her promises were. Was that the definition of blind faith? Before anyone could answer, however, a crashing sound came from the direction of the entrance to the stone lodge. It seemed as though someone had just smashed through the door. There was a short scream, which quickly grew silent. Something fell on the floor. Then, the sound of heavy footsteps could be heard, drawing closer to the hall where all the people had gathered. A few moments later, its door was shattered, too, exploding into a shower of splinters along with the bits of stone that surrounded it. A giant of a man walked into the hall, his mere presence making the entire space look tiny. Compared to him, even Effie seemed to be of average height. There was a morose expression on his face and a dark glint in his cold, cruel eyes. The giant did not wear any armor, allowing his monumental muscles to strain the fabric of a sleeveless silk shirt. It appeared that Tez Sai, the fearsome leader of the castle guard, had decided to welcome the cohort back to the Dark City himself. Nef's followers paled, their fiery indignation replaced by fear. What a monster, Sunny thought indifferently, pondering on what the quickest way to kill the morose giant would be. Behind Tez Sai, a group of guards, each wearing a sturdy armor and wielding memory weapons, could be seen. Their eyes were immediately drawn to the robust figure of the tall huntress, and then, hateful smiles appeared on their faces. The guards seemed very happy to finally find the woman accused of murdering their own. The giant only glanced at Effie and then turned to Nephis. His deep, low voice resounded in the stone hall, sending shivers running through the hearts of many sleepers gathered there. Changing Star. So you're alive after all. She met his gaze and endured it without flinching. You must be Tez Sai. To what do I owe the pleasure? The giant lingered before answering. The corner of his mouth twitched and slowly curled upward. Finally, he said, Oh no. The pleasure is all mine. Then, he raised his mighty arm and pointed at Effie. Lord Gunlog has invited this one to the castle, to face punishment for her crimes. You should have trained your dogs better, Changing Star. See what happens when they go around biting people. He lowered his hand and flexed his shoulders, then looked at her with a dark expression. Now, I would advise you rats to step aside and let me take that she-wolf with me. Nephis crossed her arms and stared at the giant, cold sparks igniting in the depths of her calm gray eyes. A few moments later, she said evenly, Or what? Chapter 290 Judgment Day. Chapter 290 Judgment Day. Changing Star's words brought the room to dead silence. On both sides of it, people were slowly preparing themselves, dark resentment burning in their eyes. It felt as though the tension reached critical mass and was about to explode into a storm of violence. Only 3 people remained calm and unaffected by the direness of the situation: Nephis herself, Sunny, and Tez Sai. The giant bared his canines in a grin. His eyes, however, remained cold as ice. What a revelation! And here I was, thinking that you are a great defender of justice. Were you not, Changing Star? Or is your sense of justice reserved only for the crimes of those who don't serve you? He sighed and added, his voice full of disappointment. That huntress of yours is accused of murder. Why are you trying to prevent me from bringing her to justice? I thought that you, of all people, would not get in the way of fairness. Nephi's frowned. Accused does not mean convicted. Why do you claim that she is guilty? Tezai stared at her and said, his low voice sending tremors through the stone hall. There is plenty of evidence. There are plenty of witnesses. So many people came forward to give a testimony. Her guilt is undeniable. How will you answer that, Changing Star? Sunny smiled slightly. How peculiar. So many people apparently saw Effie slaughter those fools. Did I imagine killing them or what? I was a bit crazy at the time, to be fair. Ha! Before Nephi could answer, Kai suddenly took a step forward and shouted, That is impossible! However, she made him stop with a stern look. The charming young man hesitated, then gritted his teeth and fell silent, glaring at Tezai with burning indignation. Changing Star turned to the imposing giant and smiled. Well, that changes everything then. Please forgive me if you can. I have been away from the Dark City for so long, and wasn't informed of these developments. If this is the case, then by all means take her away. Effie grimaced and looked at her with an amused expression. Sunny did not take his eyes off of Tezai, however. His shadow stared at Nephi's too. The smile suddenly disappeared from her face, replaced by boundless coldness. However, I am coming with her. All of us are, in fact. We are awfully curious to see that evidence and hear those witnesses. And most of all, we are all dying to see justice done and those guilty punished. Surely, Lord Gunlog would not mind. An expression of dissatisfaction appeared on Tezai's face. With a deep frown, he looked down on Neph from his oppressive height and said in a growling voice, Why do you think that you can come, wench? Changing Star was silent for a few moments, calmly looking at him. Then, her eyes suddenly shone with furious white light. In a voice that promised agony and death, she said with contempt, Who's going to stop me? The giant stared at her with a complicated expression. It seemed as though he was being torn between pride and fear. It was all a mask, though. A masterful performance to hide his true emotions, triumph and jubilation. He had come here with the excuse of bringing Effie to justice, but his true goal had always been Nephi's. She was the one Gunlog wanted to destroy. And now, she was bringing herself to him, like a lamb going to slaughter. What Tezai did not know was that Changing Star was as far from a lamb as one could be, more like a demon in sheep's clothing. Sunny glanced at the morose giant with something that resembled pity. Meanwhile, Tezai slowly shook his head and said, his voice full of false reluctance, Fine. Do as you wish. Come with me to the castle, if you want. Bring your rats with you. All of you will witness the brilliance of our Lord. All together, they exited the lodge. Tezai was walking in the front, holding the tall huntress by the shoulder. Her hands were tied behind her back with a flimsy rope, more of a symbolic gesture than a real restraint, considering Effie's strength. Nephi was keeping close, her face calm and indifferent. The guards and the members of Changing Star's faction were right behind them, throwing menacing looks at each other. Their faces were grim and full of resentful indignation. Sunny had hidden himself in the crowd, not wishing to draw any attention. Now, he was moving with it, feeling the restless agitation through the chaotic movement of the surrounding shadows. As they moved toward the castle, more and more slum dwellers surrounded them, their faces full of shock and anger. They got Effie! Bastards! Let her go! Lady Nephi! Do something! Glancing at the growing number of people who were gathering around them, she smiled reassuringly and said, Stay calm! Come with us if you want. Today, we'll see justice done! However, her appeal to remain calm had the opposite effect on the crowd. It ignited it instead, and soon, a clamor of shouts rose above the outer settlement. Justice! Justice! However, at some point, the tone of it changed. an almost palpable sense of bloodlust finding its way into the people's voices. The word they were shouting was also replaced, and soon, the crowd was chanting something else. Calling not for justice, but for judgment. Judgment! Judgment! Sonny observed the raging beast of the human crowd with a troubled frown. A cold, familiar emotion grasped his heart. He knew this sickening feeling all too well. It was the same way he felt when facing frenzied nightmare creatures. Hell, as they drew close to the stairs leading to the entrance of the castle, almost 100 people were following them. The guards standing at the gates stared at the crowd with a bit of fear in their eyes, and at some point, Castor appeared out of nowhere and took position right behind Nephi's. The proud legacy looked pale and a bit disheveled, but it seemed that he had managed to complete the mysterious task given to him by changing star without receiving any wounds. A few moments later, they entered the bright castle. Chapter 291 Eye of the Storm. Chapter 291 Eye of the Storm. The crowd poured into the castle, their faces contorted with anger and resentment. However, as soon as the slum dwellers passed beneath the swaying skulls that hung above the gates, their fury turned cold. In the echoing stone halls of the bright castle, it was hard to forget that Gunlog's power was absolute. For as long as any of them remembered, he had ruled over the dark city with an iron fist, elevating those who bowed to him and destroying those who did not. Countless men and women had tried to challenge the Bright Lord in the past. Great people, terrible people, and everyone in between. It was their skulls that now stared at the crowd, darkness nesting in their eyes. Finally, doubt and fear appeared in the hearts of the inhabitants of the outer settlement. Many of them stared at Nephi's, their faces turning dim and listless. Changing Star did not react to this sudden change in one way or another. Looking straight ahead, she calmly walked forward, an indifferent expression on her face. Her usual mask was in its place once again, preventing anyone from knowing her true thoughts. Trying to remain unnoticed, Sonny made his way to the front of the crowd to be closer to Nephi's, Effie, and Castor. No one paid him any attention. In the grand scheme of things, people thought of him as an insignificant piece, if at all, just like he wanted them to. From his point of view, the atmosphere in the bright castle seemed to be a bit strange, and not because of the invading horde of slum dwellers. Its halls and corridors were too empty, too lifeless. He didn't see any people hurrying on their daily business, as they always would. Even the opulent desk in the entrance hall was empty, the clerk usually present behind it absent for some reason. Where is everyone? His question was soon answered. Entering the throne room, he saw hundreds of sleepers standing along its walls, waiting to meet them. It seemed as though the whole population of the bright castle had gathered here. There were the guards, the hunters, the artisans, the quiet handmaidens. Even people who paid tribute to remain in the castle were all there. Sonny noticed a few familiar faces. Stev, the large man in charge of the memory market, stood uncomfortably near the members of the host. There was also Iko, the owner of the gambling den, and many others whom he remembered from his brief stay in the castle. The air was tense and heavy. It seemed that not all of these people had come to the throne room of their own free will. Many of them had troubled, frightened expressions on their faces. Others were relaxed and joyful, waiting for an entertaining show with dark fascination burning in their eyes. What disturbed him the most were the several figures of nightmare creatures standing among the humans. Those were the echoes belonging to the inhabitants of the castle, each one more terrifying than the other. Why are they out of their owner's soul seas? On the raised dais at the far end of the great hall, illuminated by the false stars that were carved into the wall of the dark alcove, the 4 lieutenants of the Bright Lord stood. There was Gemma, the leader of the hunters, Keto, the chief artisan, and Saishan, who was in charge of the handmaidens, and Haruz, of course. Sonny stared at the dreadful hunchback, who just stood there with his usual bored expression, looking at the wall. He was pretty sure that today, at least one of them was going to die.as if feeling his gaze. Haruz suddenly turned and glanced at Sonny. This time, however, Sonny did not look away. He stared straight into the hunchback's glassy eyes, a calm and calculating expression on his face. I wonder how he killed all those people without being seen even once. With so many victims, somebody had to catch a glimpse of this butcher hard at work. What aspect ability does he possess? How do I counter it? Haru stared at him for a few moments, then tilted his head and smiled with strange amusement. A second later, he turned away and looked at the wall again, seemingly losing all interest. Meanwhile, Tessai walked to the middle of the hall and threw Effie down, forcing her to kneel on the floor. Then, he gave Nephis a dark look and joined the other lieutenants on the steps leading to the throne. The 200 or so slum dwellers were standing at one end of the throne room, their faces grim and full of dark apprehension. With the exception of those directly serving Changing Star, most of them were dressed in dirty rags, with only a few wearing a proper armor. Some were unarmed, some had memories or makeshift weapons hanging on their belts, and some even had swords hastily fashioned out of the talons of the slain Spire messenger. Opposite them, with their back to the throne, stood the people of the castle. Many of them looked like they didn't want to be here, but more had contempt and indignation in their eyes. Those were mostly the members of the host, who were more than 200 people strong. Each of them was clad in a sturdy memory armor and wielded enchanted weapons. They were strong, well-fed, and experienced in combat. The hunters, especially, were a formidable presence despite their comparatively small number. They were looking at Nephis with intense hatred, the memory of her killing one of their own in this very hall still fresh in their minds. Changing Star stood beside Effie in the middle of the empty space between the two groups, looking at the white throne. Her ivory face was cold and indifferent, and her silver hair glinted in the rays of sunshine that fell through tall windows. Sparks of light were dancing in the depths of her calm gray eyes. She was the focal point of everyone's attention and the target of the dark storm of emotions that raged between the ancient walls of the castle today. If it bothered her, she did not show it. And then, finally, the Bright Lord himself appeared. Sunny knew that Gunnalug entered the great hall even before seeing him. He knew it because of the sudden change in the people that surrounded him. It was as though a wave of invisible pressure had crashed into the crowd, forcing them to groan and bend, almost buckling to the ground. Their legs trembled, their faces paled, and drops of sweat appeared on their skin, as well as fear and panic in their eyes. The mastermind behind this ghoulish spectacle had finally arrived. Chapter 292 Just Cause. Chapter 292 Just Cause. Gunnalug looked just like the last time Sunny had seen him, like a golden demon born of some harrowing hell. The Bright Lord was tall and had broad, powerful shoulders. His body was clad in a strange armor that seemed to be made out of molten gold. It was both solid and liquid, flowing over his mighty muscles and covering him from head to toe. Not even Gunnalug's eyes were exposed. In the place where his face should have been, there was nothing but a smooth and empty expanse of polished gold. The great hall of the bright castle reflected in it, and all the people gathered there did, too. As soon as Sunny saw the golden mask, he felt the oppressive aura that radiated from the Bright Lord. Even knowing what was going to happen, he couldn't help but shake a little and bite his lip. The mind assault of the golden armor was truly hard to endure. Even with the protection of the puppeteer's shroud, he felt it pressing on him, making it hard to breathe. Deep inside, a primal, bestial fear was clawing at his heart, but this fear did not belong to him. It was fake. With a dark grimace, Sunny strangled it and made it disappear. Walking out of the darkness of the alcove like a golden apparition, Gunnalug glanced at the mass of people below him and sat on the throne. His pose was relaxed and casual, as though he was here to leisurely resolve a trivial matter, not decide someone's fate. Hundreds of fates, perhaps. However, despite his laid-back attitude, everyone gathered in the great hall swayed a little, pressed down to the ground by the incredible force of his presence. The Bright Lord lingered for a few moments, and then said, his serpentine voice full of mirth, "Ah, what a sight! All my precious wards gathered here, united in the desire to see justice prevail. This dedication, this fervor for the rule of law, oh, It just makes my blood boil with appreciation. Don't you think it's wonderful? He laughed and turned his head slightly, peering directly at Nephi's. She lowered her head a bit, an almost imperceptible tremor running through her body. To Sunny, though, it seemed as though the plates of marble beneath her feet were about to crack from the terrifying pressure of Gunlog's gaze. Nevertheless, she endured it without showing much of the tremendous strain she was under. The Bright Lord paused and then echoed his words, a note of some dark emotion finding its way into his voice. Don't you think it's wonderful, changing star of the immortal Flame Clan? Nephis gritted her teeth, struggling to remain steady under the psychic onslaught of the golden armor. When she finally answered, her voice sounded suppressed. Indeed. Gunnlug remained silent for a bit. Although his face was hidden behind the golden mask, Sunny had a feeling that he was smiling. Finally he spoke. How nice. Somehow, I was under the impression that you would disagree. I've been told by my most loyal aides that you are a disagreeable person. I guess you just can't trust anyone these days. With that, he glanced at his lieutenants, making them pale and shiver. Sunny shivered too. The message hidden in those words was clear. Gunlog was letting Nephis know that he had known that she had a spy among the highest ranks of his people all along, and didn't care. Maybe even silently allowed it to happen. Damnation, how much did he know? Finally, the Bright Lord looked at Effie. After a few seconds had passed in tense silence, he spoke to her with a hint of sadness. We meet again, Effie. What a shame that it is in these tragic circumstances. If only you had listened to me and joined the host, perhaps then you might not have fallen so low. Such pity. He shook his head and sighed. I had high hopes for you. But alas, murdering innocent humans is not something that can be forgiven. Look at yourself. Instead of a noble hunter, you have turned into a wild beast. But that is what happens when people refuse my grace. They become no better than nightmare creatures. His somber words echoed in the silence of the great hall, making people lower their gazes. Effie trembled, pressed down by the force of his undivided attention. But then, she grinned and answered, her raspy voice sounding relaxed and carefree. She only said 2 words. Fuck off. Gunlog laughed and raised his hands in a helpless gesture. I rest my case. You all see how unrepentant this vile murderer is. There's not a drop of remorse left in her corrupted, rotten soul. That is why, with a heavy heart, I have to sentence this once promising young woman to death. She has to answer for her crimes, and leaving her alive would put you, my wards, in danger. I am left with no choice. A hum of voices rose from the crowd. Slum dweller or an inhabitant of the castle, everyone was affected by his last words. Don't you dare, bastard! Kill that murderer! Effie! We're here! Make her pay! Lady Nephis! You can't let them! Kill her! Kill all of them! Unaffected by this outburst of boiling emotions, Nephis put a hand on Effie's shoulder and looked at the Bright Lord with a cold expression. Staring directly at the golden mask, she frowned and said, her voice clear and loud, I object. The storm of voices suddenly grew quiet. Everyone turned to her, 2 kinds of expectation hiding in their eyes. One was full of hope, the other full of vicious glee. Gunlog tilted his head. Object? What do you mean? Her guilt has been proven without any room left for doubt. There is nothing you can do to change the outcome. He paused for a moment, and then suddenly leaned forward, his insidious voice washing over the great hall like a wave. Well? Unless, of course. Changing Star looked at him with dark resolve and lowered her chin stubbornly. Then she said, I want to invoke the right of challenge. Chapter 293 The Challenge. Chapter 293 The challenge. In echoing silence fell on the great hall of the ancient castle. The fateful words had been spoken, and now there was no turning back. For better or for worse, Gunlog tilted his head and stayed quiet for a few moments. Then, the sound of his laughter rolled over the crowd. The right of challenge? Oh, that old thing. You are awfully fond of that tradition, it seems. Not even a full year since you have arrived under my roof, and I had the pleasure of hearing you say those words twice. Insolent girl. He paused for a few moments, and then leaned forward. His voice suddenly turned cold, full of dark undertones. To be honest, I am very tired of your insolence, Changing Star. Before Nephi could answer, the Bright Lord suddenly rose from his throne, towering above the crowd like a statue cast from pure gold. Then, he took a leisurely step forward and began descending the stairs of the dais. With each step, the sound of his serpentine voice resounded, growing lower and lower, until it turned into a fiendish, wrathful growl. Your little games were fun at first, but the more I observed your clumsy attempts at playing the hero, the more disgusted I became. I couldn't believe how naive, self-righteous, and stupid you turned out to be. It made me sick. It made me want to do things that I promised myself to never do again. I expected better from the daughter of the immortal flame. To disappoint me so thoroughly. His growl reverberated through the great hall, and then abruptly disappeared. A moment later, Gunlog suddenly threw his head back and laughed brightly. Oh, but then it hit me! I was such a fool! You fooled me so beautifully! Brilliantly done, Changing Star! Please do accept my compliment! After I saw the real you, it was such a joy to watch your performances. He left the stairs and stepped on the marble floor of the throne room. The crowd of the castle inhabitants parted in front of him, people hurrying to get as far away from the oppressive aura of the golden armor as they could. The Bright Lord sighed. It's such a shame that all of this will have to stop now. You see, while I can't help but applaud your effort, in the end, you still turned out to be just another fool. He glanced at Effie and asked, his voice full of mockery. A challenge? I don't think it's your place to demand such a thing. You are not the one accused of the crime, after all. If someone has to invoke the right of challenge, it should be Effie herself. Don't you think? Nephi gritted her teeth, struggling to remain poised under the assault of the psychic pressure. Refusing to turn away from the polished mirror of the Bright Lord's face, she said, It's just like one of your minions said. I am responsible for the actions of my people. Any crime they commit is my crime. Gunlog watched her, his expression hidden. Neff's pale face was reflected in his mask, staring back at her with merciless gray eyes. After a while he spoke. Sound logic. Who are you going to challenge, then? She hesitated for a few moments, then said steadily, Whoever it was that passed the guilty verdict. The Bright Lord chuckled. Oh? But by the same logic, that would be me. She smiled darkly and glared at him, white flames dancing in her eyes. Then you are the one I challenge! Her words resounded in the great hall, sending hundreds of people gathered there into a state of stunned shock. So, this is it. Sunny looked at the crowd of stunned people, mentally separating them into two groups. Those who were going to be a threat and those who were not. Regardless of how the fight between Nephi and Gunlog ended, the small enclave of humans living in the Dark City was going to descend into utter chaos. If Changing Star was killed, her followers would make her into a martyr and go insane. The host would not just let them off, either. If the Bright Lord fell, no matter how much of a bastard Gunlog was, he was also the glue that held this whole place together. Without a tyrant enforcing some semblance of order, no matter how ghoulish, things would get really ugly really fast. Who was going to stop the nightmare creatures from wiping the humans out then? In any case, there was going to be a bloodbath. But he was done worrying about these matters. In the upcoming mayhem, Sunny's goals were very simple. Remain alive. Protect Nephi. Make sure that she becomes the new tyrant of the Dark City, so that she could carve the way back to reality for a few lucky survivors. If she doesn't die right here and now, of course. In the silence that enveloped the great hall, the Bright Lord laughed and tilted his head, staring at Changing Star from behind his golden mask. Then he said, How audacious! I wonder what gives you the confidence to dare challenge me. Various people have tried to kill me, you know. I have a little hobby, actually, collecting their skulls. Come to think of it, your pretty head would look really well in my collection." Suddenly, he raised a hand and gestured to his forehead. Don't tell me that it's all because of that little toy that you took off the First Lord's corpse." "Oh no! That would be terrible. You didn't really think that one powerful memory would be enough to defeat me?" Nephi lingered for a while, glaring at Gunlog. Then, she said evenly, "My bare hands would be enough to defeat a worm like you. The memory is just to make it quicker." Gunlog stared at her for a moment, and then chuckled. "Great! This is great! Such spirit! I will really enjoy breaking you, Changing Star." When this done, he flexed his shoulders and said, his voice sending shivers into the hearts of hundreds of people gathered in the hall, "All right. I accept your challenge." Chapter 294 Song of Steel. Chapter 294 Song of Steel. The great hall of the bright castle grew silent and still. However, that stillness was not tranquil, but like a predator that fell low to the ground, ready to explode into a violent lunge to tear its prey apart. The sleepers pressed themselves against the walls, giving Changing Star and the Bright Lord space for their battle. Effie was dragged away from the middle of the hall by 2 guards, and now, there was nothing but emptiness separating the 2 fighters. From one side of the hall, the 5 lieutenants, Gemma, Tezai, Kido, Saishin, and Haruz, were looking at their master with complicated emotions. On the other side of it, Kai, Castor, and the leaders of the outer settlement hunting parties were doing the same. Cassie was also there, her hand resting on the hilt of the quiet dancer. There was a grim, somber expression on her beautiful face. Sunny glanced at the blind girl, and then turned to the center of the throne room. 2 people were standing opposite each other there. One was a tall man encased in a strange golden carapace that followed the lines of his mighty body. The other was a young woman in an elegant plate armor forged of white metal. There was a subtle similarity between them. Both were emanating a striking, compelling sense of power and confidence that very few people ever possessed. Both were fearsome and deadly. Both were at the apex of their kind. However, this was where the similarity ended. This doesn't not look good, Sunny thought, evaluating the 2 fighters. He knew better than anyone what Nephi was capable of, but even then, the sight of her facing Gunlog made a deep scowl appear on her face. The Bright Lord was much taller than her and weighed probably twice as much as Changing Star. He was stronger, had longer reach, and much more experience in slaughtering people. That was not even considering that damned golden armor of his. Even with the miraculous augmentation of the Dawn Shard, Nef's silver sword could barely be considered at the same power level as an ascended weapon would have been. That was still a whole rank below Gunlog's strange echo. Trying to break through that armor was going to be as hard as cracking the shell of a carapace centurion with a sword forged from mundane steel. Incredibly hard, if not impossible. And unlike the carapace of a scavenger, the golden echo did not seem to have a weak spot. At that moment, sparks of light appeared in the air in front of Changing Star. The silver longsword appeared in her hand, and she pointed it to the ground. For now, what weapon is that bastard going to use? That would decide a lot. Sunny was sure that Gunlog possessed an arsenal of powerful memory weapons. But how powerful were they exactly? He glanced at the Bright Lord, expecting to see the same sparks swirling around his hands. However, there was none. Instead, the liquid gold flowed forward and assumed the shape of a heavy battle axe, which Gunlog then grasped and leisurely put on his shoulder. The polished mirror of his mask reflected the slight frown that appeared on Nef's face. Damn it! The weapon the Bright Lord was going to use was also a part of his echo, and as such, possessed the quality of a transcended weapon. It was going to cut through the Starlight Legion armor without much effort. This is even worse than I imagined. As Sunny gritted his teeth, Gunlog said in a serpentine, insidious voice. Any last words, Changing Star? Nephi tilted her head a little and remained silent for a while. Her helmet weaved itself from strings of light, hiding her face completely. with only calm gray eyes visible through the crack of the visor. Finally, she answered with only one word, her usually even voice full of furious contempt. Traitor! A wave of whispers spread through the crowd. People were guessing what exactly she meant by that, but Sunny suspected that he was the only one who knew. Neff wasn't accusing Gunlog of betraying his fellow humans or causing the deaths of numerous young men and women. She was accusing him of betraying the true duty of the awakened and submitting to the nightmare spell instead of fighting it to the bitter end. In her mind, that was a far greater crime. The only crime, even. The Bright Lord laughed. That's too bad. I heard that one before. And then, without wasting even a fraction of a second, he suddenly exploded forward in a terrifying, lightning-fast lunge. The shift between peace and violence was so instant and swift that most people gathered in the Great Hall did not even realize what was happening until a few moments later. With each of Gunlog's strides, the floor of the throne room shook a little. He flew at Nephi's like a furious giant made of gold, swinging his battle axe with both incredible agility and horrible force. She barely reacted in time, shifting her body and raising the sword to deflect the killing blow to the side. However, then something unexpected happened. The shaft of the battle axe suddenly elongated, the liquid gold comprising it flowing forward to assume a new shape. As a result, her deflection ended up being almost useless. With an awkward stagger, Changing Star reeled back. The very edge of the battle axe's blade bit into the helmet of the Starlight Legion armor and effortlessly cleaved through it, leaving a shallow cut on her cheek. In the next moment, Gunlog's foot crashed into her ribs, sending the young woman flying through the air. Nephis landed in a roll and used one hand to stop herself from sliding on the marble floor. As drops of blood fell from beneath her helmet, merciless white flames ignited in her eyes. A moment later, she jumped forward and met the onslaught of the Bright Lord with an equal amount of fury. The deadly song of clashing steel resounded in the ancient hall, like a promise of much greater bloodshed yet to come. Chapter 295 The Duel. Chapter 295 The Duel. The breastplate of Neff's armor cracked from the force of Gunlog's blow and there was blood streaming from beneath her helmet, but that didn't slow Changing Star one bit. Jumping forward to meet the Bright Lord's assault, she dodged the blade of the battle axe, twisted, and tried to deliver a strike of her own. A furious clangor of metal exploded in the silence of the Great Hall, both fighters moving with incredible speed, precision, and skill. In a span of several seconds, they exchanged numerous blows, but each was either deflected, dodged, or blocked. This terrifying clash was not at all like Sunny had imagined. There was nothing elegant, graceful, or elevated about it. All there was barbarous violence and cruel brutality, each of the fighters doing everything in their power to break, cripple, and kill their opponent. Their voices sounded like that of wild beasts, partially from the incredible strain of the duel, but also to let out the suffocating bloodlust and murderous intent that were drowning their minds. That was not to say that any one of them had lost control of their thoughts and actions. Both were cold-blooded killers and knew how to remain calm in the throes of the most terrible rage. A few seconds later, Gunlog and Nephis disengaged and staggered away from each other, letting the spectators draw in shaky breaths. The Bright Lord's golden armor was pristine and unscathed. Nephis, however, had several bloody cuts on her body, the black material encompassing it torn and ripped. Another crack appeared on one of her pauldrons. She glanced at it briefly and then indifferently turned back to watch her enemy. Everyone in the throne room, in one way or another, was thinking about the same thing, a cold and sickening feeling slowly spreading through their chests. How would they fare in such a fight themselves? The answer was simple. They would have been long dead, eviscerated in mere seconds by one of these awesome fighters. Everyone felt death breathing down their necks. Among all the people watching their fight, however, there were two who observed Changing Star's every move with a special kind of attention. They were Sunny and Castor. Their reasons for studying how Nephis fought were entirely different, but also almost the same. Just a second of rest, and the two fighters lunged at each other once again. This time, however, their behavior was different. The first clash was just a test to gauge what the enemy was capable of. Now, they were not holding anything back, throwing everything they had at the enemy. At least that was how it seemed. Changing Star's sword suddenly flashed with brilliant radiance. Removing one hand from the hilt, she grasped the incandescent blade with her armored gauntlet at the middle to better control its tip and raised it to shoulder level. With Gunlog's ability to change the length of his weapon at will and almost impregnable armor, this grip was more advantageous. The Bright Lord absorbed the battle axe back into his armor. Then 2 straight blades grew out of his forearms, creating weapons that resembled long, heavy punching daggers. They clashed once again, this time with even more fury. The people pressing themselves into the walls of the throne room trembled. Nephi seemed to abandon a lot of her defense, willing to take much bigger risks to obliterate the enemy. The reach of her sword was much shorter now, but the silver blade also grew much more agile and unpredictable. Gunlog's daggers were a true menace to resist, however. They flew at her from all sides, either in tandem or in a staggered rhythm, making it hard for the young woman to predict and deflect each blow. But she wasn't trying to. Changing Star seemed willing to receive many shallow wounds to get a chance to land a strike on her opponent. More bloody lacerations appeared on her body, the Starlight Legion armor barely holding together. But she achieved her goal, in the end. Catching one of Gunlog's daggers between the blade of her sword and her body, she forcefully twisted the sword sideways and caused him to turn his torso. Then, Nephi sidestepped and suddenly appeared behind the Bright Lord, with a fraction of a second left before he could turn around and defend himself. Her incandescent sword finished its arc high above her head, and changing back to the standard grip, she brought it down with all her strength on Gunlog's shoulder. The radiant white blade flashed through the air and bit into the golden armor, and then it slid fruitlessly off its bright surface, not leaving even a scratch on it. Damn it all! In the next moment, Gunlog threw the sword to the side with one arm and delivered a terrifying blow with the other, his dagger aimed at Neff's face. She managed to turn her head at the last moment, avoiding instant death, but was still caught by the enemy's fist. The impact was so strong that Changing Star was thrown backward several meters. The helmet had shattered completely, revealing a pale, bloodied face, with bits of metal piercing the skin. She rolled several times and came to a stop, then rose to her feet with some effort. The white flames dimmed a little, and there was a dark, disoriented emotion in her eyes. The gem of the dawn shard shone gently right above them, illuminating Neff's wounded face. A moment later, she dismissed what little remained of the helmet and stared at Gunlog with resentment, blood running from the cuts on her cheeks. The Bright Lord laughed and made a step toward Changing Star, his voice echoing under the roof of the great hall like a death sentence. "What?" "That was all." Nephi did not answer. Instead, she placed both hands on the blade of her sword, holding it with its hilt and cross-guard up, like a makeshift mace. The radiance of the silver sword spread to encompass all of it. But it didn't stop there. Sonny opened his eyes wide. "What?" The furious white flames spread from the sword to Changing Star's hands, her arms, and then devoured her figure completely. But they weren't burning in the white, cracked metal of the Starlight Legion armor. Instead, the brilliant radiance was emanating from her skin. Chapter 296 Creature of Light. Chapter 296 Creature of Light. Sonny stared at the shining figure in front of him, a myriad of thoughts appearing in his mind. With her skin emanating blinding white radiance, Nephi looked beautiful and pure, as though untouched by the imperfections of the mundane world. Wreathed in light, she was like a heavenly angel that descended into the mortal realm. The sight of it was both breathtaking and terrifying. It was also eerily similar to the image of the radiant creature he had seen on the walls of the ancient mine. Especially with the gem of the dawn shard burning on Neff's forehead like a third eye. But that wasn't what gave Sonny pause. How is possible? But then, why wouldn't it be possible? At the start of their journey, he had guessed that Changing Star's aspect was of the divine rank, just like his. Her powers seemed to be able to either augment memories or heal, while his own could be used to scout, enhance memories, or augment Sunny himself. Because Nephi's had never used the white flames to achieve that last effect, he had assumed that she was incapable of doing so, and thus her aspect, while powerful, was less versatile. But augmenting herself was exactly what Neph was doing right now. Sunny knew it instantly. She wrapped her body in light just like he had wrapped his own body in the shadow countless times. With this enhancement, her physical prowess had to grow exponentially. Had she always been capable of doing so and hid that facet of her aspect intentionally, or was this something she learned how to do only after growing more powerful and absorbing hundreds upon hundreds of soul shards in the labyrinth? That question was going to remain unanswered, at least for now. Because the battle between Changing Star and the Bright Lord was far from over. Just like Sunny suspected, with her body wreathed in light, Nephi suddenly became much stronger and faster. If before she was visibly weaker and slower than Gunlog, even if not by much, now, it seemed the other way around. She dashed toward the enemy, batted away one of the daggers, and delivered a crushing blow right to the polished mirror mask. This time, there was a slight mark left on the surface of the golden armor by her sword. The two of them became locked in a ferocious battle, dozens of attacks flying at each fighter. The clangor of metal grew in volume, turning into an almost deafening cacophony. Changing Star was fighting with abandon, more and more wounds accumulating on her radiant body. However, she also managed to land several more blows, each striking at the golden mirror of the Bright Lord's face. Slowly, a hint of a crack started to appear on its surface. Sunny also noticed that her wounds weren't healing. It seemed as if Nephi's was only capable to support two effects at the same time, one augmenting her sword, the other her body. To summon the healing power of the white flame, she had to sacrifice one or the other. But she was unwilling to doubt. A few moments later, it seemed as though Gunlog was slowly starting to lose ground. His enemy was just too fast, powerful, and ferocious. More and more strikes landed on the golden armor, and although it seemed to hold, for now, it was clear that the continuous blows were taking a toll on both the Bright Lord and his echo. However, the Golden Serpent had a few tricks up his sleeve, too. When the momentum of the fight began to favor Nephi's, he suddenly chuckled and turned his face to catch her reflection in the mirror mask. A second later, the sound of muffled groans could be heard escaping from the mouths of hundreds of people. The psychic pressure emanated by the Bright Lord suddenly increased manyfold, throwing some people to the ground and making others stagger. Sunny saw blood flowing from people's noses, eyes, and mouths. He himself also felt it, and gritted his teeth, struggling to remain standing. He almost failed. Changing Star, who was at the center and the true target of the mental assault, let out a pained yelp and staggered. That was the moment when Gunlog stepped forward and stabbed her through the chest with one of his daggers. As the long blade pierced the lithe body of the young woman and exited from her back, he said in a calm and friendly voice, There. That's enough. Go die now, stupid girl." Then, he twisted the dagger, making her scream once again. Nephi stared at him, blood flowing from her mouth. Then, she raised her sword and hit him in the face with the pommel, again and again, until a small crack finally appeared on the surface of the mirror mask. But the crushing wave of mental pressure did not go away. Instead, it only increased. Gunalug laughed. "Are you done? No? Well, let me help you then." His second daughter flashed through the air, slashing Nephi's across the wrist. With the tendons cut, the silver sword fell from her hand, its radiance dimming. Nephi's used her other hand to push the Bright Lord away and slid off the blade of the dagger, then staggered away, eventually falling to her knees. The white radiance emanated from her body grew brighter, and the wound on her body began to heal. A low groan escaped from her lips. Gunalug approached the kneeling young woman, laughing. "Did you think I wouldn't know about that little trick of yours? Go ahead and heal. See where it gets you." With that, he grabbed her by the neck and stabbed her again, reopening the terrible wound that had just closed once again. "How's that? Come on, heal it again." With a ferocious growl, he continued stabbing her, over and over, his hand quickly becoming painted red with blood. "Oh, this is really fun! But a bit tiring. How about I just cut off your pretty head right now and end this?" Nephi spat some blood and turned her head to face him, and then she closed her eyes. Back when they had first arrived in the Dark City, Sunny had noticed that Cassie wasn't affected by the psychic pressure of the golden armor at all. From that, he deduced that the source of the mental assault was not the armor itself, but the golden mirror of its face, or, to be exact, seeing your reflection in it. After returning from the castle, he had shared that insight with Nephi. It seemed that she remembered it. With her eyes closed, Changing Star raised her hands and grabbed the bright lord that was strangling her by the shoulders. Then, she used her whole body to deliver a devastating blow to his face, the gem of the crown of dawn hitting Gunnalug right where his nose should have been. Finally, the surface of the golden mirror cracked and shattered. Through the small Bria, a blue eye full of murderous joy was revealed. Shocked by the sudden blow, Gunnlod staggered away. "You bitch!" The daggers were instantly absorbed into the golden armor, replaced by the heavy battle axe again. But he didn't get the chance to use it. With her eyes still closed, Nephi swiftly turned to the sound of his voice. Then, she raised her hand, opened her fist, and blew on it. The next moment, a cloud of red sand shot from her palm and enveloped Gunnlod. Sunny stared at it in shock, an expression of sudden recognition appearing on his face. He knew the look at that cloud all too well. It wasn't sand. It was the blood flower pollen. Chapter 297 Red Flower. Chapter 297 Red Flower. The red cloud enveloped Gunnlod, seeping through the crack in his helmet. A second too late to react, the bright lord reeled away, but not before inhaling the pollen of the nightmarish flower. Sunny didn't know when and how Nephi had gotten it, but he knew that he wasn't mistaken. This was the pollen of the blood flower, the grisly parasitic blossom that he himself had the misfortune of inhaling once, a long time ago. The memory of the bloodthirsty red flowers growing through his lungs sent shivers through Sunny's entire body. Back then, the only reason for why he had not become a host for the insidious nightmare creature was because of the blood weave. Without it, he would have been devoured from the inside in mere minutes. And now, the bright lord was going to fall to the same fate. She really did it. The rest of the sleepers gathered in the great hall did not know that Gunnlod was already as good as dead, however. Including the tyrant himself. Bending over in a fit of violent coughing, he growled, "What? What have you done to me, bitch?" Nephi was still where he had dropped her, kneeling on the floor. Her armor was shattered and torn, with rivers of blood streaming down the cracked white metal. The brilliant radiance of her skin had been extinguished, but there were incandescent flames burning under it. The horrible wounds on her chest were slowly closing, and the lacerations on her face were already gone, leaving it just as perfect as it had been before. That face, however, was bloodied and pale, contorted in an expression of terrible agony. In her eyes, however, there was dark malice. A chorus of whispers rolled through the crowd when they witnessed the ghastly wounds healing themselves. Be it the members of the host or the slum dwellers, all of them had two words on their lips. "Immortal flame! Immortal flame!" And then someone shouted, their voice full of stunned awe. This is the blessing of the fire!" Deaf to all of it, Changing Star moaned and slowly rose to her feet. Then she struggled to look at the bright lord and said, her voice shaking from pain, I killed you." Through the crack in the golden mask, Sunny saw Gunnlod's blue eye first narrow, and then suddenly open wide. In the next moment, the bright lord began coughing again. This time, a suppressed scream escaped from his lips. "It's about to start." Sunny shifted a little, subtly positioning himself closer to Castor. Gunnlod, meanwhile, staggered and groaned. There was blood dripping from beneath his broken mask. Then, a shaky laugh resounded in the throne room of the ancient castle. "Ah, did you really? What a surprise!" He dropped his battle axe, which then turned into a puddle of liquid gold and merged with the strange armor. He took a step toward Nephi, but then swayed and fell to one knee. For a few moments, the Bright Lord remained motionless. Then, his body convulsed, more blood spilling through the cracks in the visor of his golden helmet. A muffled scream could be heard once again, full of torturous pain. Hundreds of people were watching him, stunned, their eyes full of disbelief, anger, and terror. The Bright Lord raised his head and glanced at Nephites, then hissed, "What a joke! I can't die like this!" Changing Star looked down on him, her face cold and motionless. There was no triumph or gloating in her eyes. Freewebble.cm. But there was also no mercy. Turning away, she hesitated for a moment and then said, her voice strangely gentle, "Rest easy now. Your nightmare is over." Gunlog stared at her in disbelief, and then suddenly laughed. There was a disturbing, gurgling sound coming from somewhere deep in his throat, as though he was drowning in blood. "Good, this is too good. Yours is only starting, though." With that, he slowly rose and then turned away. Swaying, the Bright Lord took one step forward, then another. The crowd watched silently as he arduously made his way to the steps that led to the throne of white marble and climbed them, blood spilling from the cracks in his helmet, his golden armor flowing and swirling around his body in a state that resembled panic. Finally, Gunlog reached the dais and fell on his throne, looking down on the great hall of the ancient castle with a strange, wistful expression. Then, he strained to say something, but became twisted in a violent coughing fit instead. In the end, he just whispered a few almost inaudible words and leaned on the back of the throne, his body relaxing. Sunny was perhaps the only one who had heard him, due to the fact that his shadow was hiding in the darkness of the alcove all along. "I tried. In the beginning. I really did." This was what Gunlog had whispered, and then he grew still. The Bright Lord of the Dark City was dead. Sunny knew it instantly because of the fact that the terrible psychic aura pressing him to the ground suddenly disappeared, letting all the people around him move and breathe free. Knowing what was about to come, he glanced at the far end of the great hall one last time. A corpse in golden armor was sitting on the throne, a beautiful red blossom appearing from the crack in his polished mask. A few moments later, the armor suddenly shined with white light and then disintegrated into countless sparks, revealing the man who had ruled this cursed place for many years with an iron fist. Gunlog was surprisingly handsome. Even though his face was covered in blood, it was easy to tell. He had a short beard and long blonde hair. One of his eyes was gone, eaten through by the blood flower, and the other was quickly turning glassy. What surprised Sunny the most, though, was how young he looked. It was hard to imagine the Bright Lord as anything but powerful and ageless, but in fact, he was no older than 27. Somehow, Sunny had forgotten that fact. Kids. All of us here are just lost kids. He didn't waste too much time thinking about that, though, because in the next few moments, Tezai, who had been staring at his dead lord with his usual morose expression, turned around and looked at the crowd of slum dwellers, then at the members of the host. The giant lingered for a second and then said, his deep, dark voice reverberating through the ancient hall, "What are you waiting for? Kill them all." And then, everything descended into madness. Chapter 298 Fire and Blood. Chapter 298 Fire and Blood. The first guard to follow Tezai's order lunged forward, summoning his weapon, and fell to the ground, a heavy kunai suddenly appearing in his eye. Due to everyone's attention being drawn to the bloodied figure on the throne, no one noticed as Sunny moved his hand slightly, letting the prowling thorn fly. He wasn't looking at Gunlog, though. His eyes were drawn to Nephites, while his shadow watched Castor. When the Bright Lord died, something strange happened to Changing Star. Her eyes opened wide, losing focus, and then she swayed a little and fell to one knee. Her body was busy rearranging itself after absorbing a huge amount of soul essence, which made Nephites vulnerable for a few moments. That was when Tezai had given his order, and that was when Sunny threw his kunai and killed the guard rushing to attack the slum dwellers. Someone screamed, and in the next moment, the great hall of the castle descended into chaos. Unnoticed by anyone, Castor suddenly turned into a blur. Not so fast. Sonny was thrown off his feet and awkwardly fell, his wrists screaming in pain. He had achieved his goal, though. Even while falling, he saw the proud legacy rolling on the marble floor, tripped by the invisible string of the prowling thorn. A second later, hundreds of sleepers clashed against each other, their suppressed rage, bloodlust, and murderous resentment finally exploding into a storm of violence. The white marble was instantly painted red with blood, the guards slaughtered indiscriminately, their powerful memory armaments and training giving them a vast advantage over the disorganized crowd of slum dwellers. But they weren't killing just those who came from the outer settlement. In the panic and havoc that engulfed the throne room, differentiating friend from foe was not an easy task. Sonny saw several artisan assistants fall to their blades, as well as a few unlucky people who had paid a heavy tribute in exchange for the promise of safety. With Gunlog gone, that safety was now gone. It almost seemed as though the guards didn't care who they killed, or were even glad to be let off the chain. Even if there were those among them who had preserved some vestiges of conscience, now, it was utterly gone, devoured by the crowd instinct and the exhilaration of being free from all restraints. Their faces were contorted with ferocious grimaces, and their eyes burned with rage, hatred, and tenebrous joy. This was perhaps the most disturbing and frightening thing that Sonny had ever seen, and he had seen some of the most chilling horrors the dream realm had to offer. How can humans do this to other humans? But that question was moot, and also hypocritical. Humans were indeed the most adaptable of creatures. When they needed to, they were easily able to devoid their victims of the status of a human being, thus absolving themselves of any guilt or sin. Why feel guilty for slaughtering cattle, creatures worse than cattle, even hateful pests? Sonny had practiced that simple mind trick himself in the past. These thoughts only took him a fraction of a second. Jumping to his feet, Sonny summoned the Midnight Shard and dashed toward Nephis. The slum dwellers, meanwhile, came to their senses and met the assault of the host with as much fury and bloodlust. Even though they were less experienced, well-fed, and armed, their resolve and exalted fury made up for that. Protect Lady Nephis! Kill the bastards! Judgment! The two forces clashed, eviscerating anyone who had the misfortune of being stuck between them. Screams of terror and pain filled the great hall. The floor turned slippery with blood, and dead bodies piled on it, staring into emptiness with wide eyes. Sonny saw the scarred hunter from before dive under the strike of a young guard and drive the tip of his sword into the enemy's throat. He saw several hunters of the host lunge at Effie, who had easily tore the rope that bound her arms and met them with a ferocious grin, the beautiful bronze spear weaving itself from sparks of light in her hands. He saw Tezai crushing a random sleeper's skull with a heavy mace. The poor youth was only guilty of getting in his way. He saw people screaming in fear as they tried to flee the hall. Many fell on the floor, and were then crushed under the feet of the panicking crowd. The problem was, he didn't see Castor. Arriving near Nephis, Sonny batted someone's sword away and then punched his opponent in the face, causing him to fly back with a pained scream. He looked around, trying to notice the proud legacy, his mind cold and collected, and there he saw him. Castor may have had plans to kill Changing Star at the moment of her weakness, but thanks to Sonny's subtle intervention, he had lost that chance. Now, the legacy had bigger problems on his plate. With the enchanted Jian in his hand, he was fighting none other than Gemma, the leader of the hunters. No matter how strong and skilled Castor was, this was not an opponent that would go down easily, if at all. He couldn't extricate himself from that fight without risking being killed. Well, that problem seems to be solved. But now, there was another. Much bigger one. Back at the steps leading up to the White Throne, Haruz was standing with his back turned to the slaughter below, a strangely disoriented expression frozen on his face. Sonny could see his face because the shadow never left the darkness of the alcove, watching the dreadful hunchback's every move. Haruz was staring at Gunlog's dead body, his glassy eyes confused and empty. But then, slowly, a hint of a dark and deadly emotion appeared in them. Turning around, he studied the great hall, not disturbed even a little by the bloody chaos, the clangor of steel, and the scores of people dying in front of him. And then, his gaze fell on Nephi's crap. At that moment, both Kai and Cassie appeared by Sunny's side. Turning to them, he gestured to Changing Star and yelled, "Protect her!" At the dais, Harus tilted his head, piercing Changing Star with a murderous gaze. Slowly, his face contorted, turning bestial and terrifying. Pure hatred and insanity burned in his eyes, making anyone who accidentally glanced in his direction shudder. With a low growl, the hunchback took a step forward and outstretched his hand, ready to summon a weapon. But in the next moment, someone crashed into him at full speed. Even though Harus had dodged the flying blade at the last moment, the force of the impact was such that both men flew back, into the darkness behind the throne. Breaking through a wooden hatch that was hidden there, Sunny and Harus rolled down a long flight of stone stairs and left the havoc of the great hall behind. A few moments later, they landed on the floor of a wide corridor, and were thrown away from each other. Sunny twisted his body to regain his balance, and used the midnight shard to stop himself from sliding even farther away. Then, he rose to his feet and looked darkly at Harus, who were similarly just standing up. A cold glint appeared in his eyes. Just like Sunny had expected, today, one of them was going to die. Chapter 299 Twisted Reflection. Chapter 299 Twisted Reflection. Out in the great hall of the ancient castle, the air was full of screams and clangor of steel, with rivers of blood being spilled on the white marble floor. But in the wide corridor Sunny and Harus had found themselves in, the havoc that reigned above seemed muffled and distant. It was just the two of them here. Picking up the midnight shard from the cold stones, Sunny flexed his shoulders and looked at the hunchback. There was a dark, icy fire burning deep within his eyes. "How wonderful! We are finally alone!" The hunchback tilted his head and stared at him with his glassy eyes, not saying anything. A slight smile appeared on Sunny's lips. "What, no reaction? Well, fair enough. Allow me to introduce myself, then. My name is Sunny, and I've been craving to kill you for a long, long time." Harus remained motionless, looking at him with the same indifferent, bored expression. A hint of anger appeared on Sunny's face. Taking a subtle step sideways and slightly turning his torso, he said in a casual tone, "To tell you the truth, Harus, I have killed many monsters. Some of them were nightmare creatures, and some were men. I killed a person or two as well. But I have never done it out of malice. I've never enjoyed it too much." He paused and then spat, his voice shaking. "But I will enjoy killing you." Sunny grasped the hilt of the midnight shard with both hands and took a step forward, piercing the hunchback with a furious gaze. "You embody everything that I despise. The mere fact of your existence offends me. You sicken me, and for that reason alone I am going to end you. You don't deserve to live." Harus blinked and continued staring at him, motionless. Sunny stopped a few meters away and snarled, frustrated at the lack of response. "Do you have any idea what I had to do, what I had to sacrifice? How many things I had to let go of to save myself from becoming someone's slave? And here you are, living as one of your own free will. Bastard, what gives you the right? Who gave you the idea that you can breathe the same air as I do?" The hunchback finally showed a sign that he had heard Sunny. With a slightly irritated expression, he shook his head and said, "Talk, talk, talk. You talk too much, little worm." Sunny grinned. A dangerous spark appeared in his eyes. "Yeah? Well, what are you going to do about it?" Harus smiled, too. His smile was cold, unnatural, and frightening. "Break you? Apart. You will have to die anyway. All of you will." Sunny raised his eyebrows. "Oh, really? Why is that?" The hunchback shrugged and outstretched his hand. Weaved from the sparks of light, A heavy chain appeared from the air, wrapped around his arm from wrist to elbow. Then, he grimaced and straightened his back as much as his deformity allowed him. Before, he seemed to be of the same height as Sunny. But now, Harus towered above him almost as much as Tezai had, his twisted figure radiating a sense of vicious, bestial power. As two menacing lights ignited in his pale eyes, he growled, "Because this is the will of the Lord." Sunny laughed. "Lord? The bright Lord? I don't want to disappoint you, fool, but your Lord is dead." Harus stared at him with sincere confusion. Then, a corner of his lips curled upward. With something that almost resembled pity, he said, "Poor worm. You don't even understand what loyalty means, do you? Alive or dead, it doesn't matter." Sunny snarled. "You're right. I don't understand." Finally, he raised his sword and prepared to attack. "You know, I spent so much time trying to learn what your aspect ability and flaw are. But now, I am glad that I don't know. I don't want to kill you using a trick. I just want to obliterate you." Harus listened to him. A mocking grin appeared on his lips, and then, Sunny suddenly became blind. *****. A moment before, Sunny was looking at the hateful figure of the fearsome hunchback. Then, suddenly, his sight was gone, replaced by nothing except for boundless darkness. Almost immediately, a monstrous blow sent him flying back. Sunny hit the wall of the corridor, and then fell to the floor, leaving a trail of blood on the cold stones. His bones groaned, but held together, if barely. Harus, who had hit him in the chest with a fist, the heavy chain wrapped around his knuckles, lunged forward with terrible speed, aiming to crush the enemy's skull under his boot. His movements were swift and utterly silent. To his surprise, though, the little wretch somehow managed to roll away and jump back, avoiding death by a hair's breadth. Sunny slid backward and rose to his feet, blindly swinging the midnight shard in a wide arc in front of him. The blade of the Tachi missed the murderous hunchback entirely, but bought him a second to gather himself. Not that it was going to help. He was still blind. Of course, it all makes sense now. Sunny finally unraveled the mystery surrounding Harus. He understood why so many sleepers, no matter how skilled and with no regard to the might of their aspect abilities, had been somehow rendered powerless and easily slaughtered by Gunnalug's executioner. He also understood why there were no witnesses to the countless murders that Harus had committed. No one had ever seen him killing his victims. Their bodies were always found only after the slaughter was over. It was not because the terrifying hunchback was able to move like a ghost or possess such great power that no one could even try to resist it. It was because his aspect ability could literally make people not see him. Or anything, for that matter. It didn't matter how skilled or mighty his opponents were. Once they were blind, all their technique and abilities were made useless. Killing a blind person was an easy task. It also did not matter if someone was there to see Harus kill. As long as he wanted, he would remain unseen for as long as he wished. That's how the legend of the horrifying butcher was born. People were always more afraid of things that they couldn't see, after all. Sunny spat a mouthful of blood and grimaced. It was nice to reveal another secret. The question was, would he be able to survive knowing the truth? Chapter 300 Bright Lord's Slave. Chapter 300 Bright Lord's Slave. By a twist of fate, today, Harus was facing possibly the worst opponent he could have faced on the Forgotten Shore, among the sleepers, at least. However, Sunny wasn't surprised. He had always felt that he and the murderous hunchback were destined to end up fighting each other to the bitter end. Before, he had thought that this was just intuition, but now he knew that his occasional and subtle premonitions were anything but random. All that time ago, he had already sensed that the two of them were connected by a string of fate. Was it such a surprise, then, that his aspect happened to counter that of Harus to large extent? And it did counter it, although not completely. If anyone else was in Sunny's place, they would have been already dead. Robbed of their sight, very few people, if anyone at all, could have resisted the furious assault of the terrifyingly strong hunchback. But Sunny wasn't just anyone. Even while blind, he had shadow sense on his side. While it wasn't the same as being able to see Haru's, by sensing the movements of his shadow, Sunny was able to predict his attacks with at least some level of precision. It wasn't perfect, though. At least he had not reached the level where this form of perception could fully replace vision. So, now, Sunny had a choice to make. While his shadow was wrapped around his body, it gave him an incredible boost in strength, speed, and endurance. It wasn't able to provide him with a second pair of eyes, however. So he could either continue to rely solely on shadow sense and keep this boost, or let the shadow go and fight Haru's with just his own strength while being able to see. Decisions. Sensing the hunched shadow of the murderous butcher lunge forward, Sunny dodged left and heard something whistle past his temple with terrible speed. A fraction of a second later, and his skull would have been crushed by the links of the iron chain wrapped around his enemy's fist. He missed the hunchback's other hand, though. His wrist was suddenly caught in an iron grip and twisted, forcing Sunny to yelp and let go of the midnight shard. Another second, and his bones were going to shatter. Following the direction of the twist, Sunny performed an aerial cartwheel to save his arm and reluctantly ordered the shadow to slip off his body. As he landed on the stones, Sunny was finally able to see again. Haru's was holding him by the wrist with one hand, his other raising to deliver a crushing blow. Sunny doubted that there would be anything left of his face if he were to allow that blow to land. He still held the midnight shard in his free hand. Turning the tachi upward, Sunny thrust it in the direction of the hunchback's throat. As a hint of surprise appeared in his enemy's eyes, Haru's changed the direction of his strike, turning it into a block instead. The razor-sharp blade bit into the links of the heavy chain wrapped tightly around his forearm and bounced off. However, that gave Sunny the opportunity to wrestle his wrist free and jump back. Despite the fact that his bruised hand was shaking, he put it back on the hilt of the midnight shard and faced Haru's once again. The hunchback tilted his head and stared at Sunny with an amused expression. "Slippery worm, how are you doing that?" Sunny grinned. "Wouldn't you like to know?" Then, he grimaced and added after a few moments of pained silence. "I can still see you thanks to my aspect." Haru's grinned. "Oh? Good, it is nice of you to tell me." With that, he suddenly threw his hand forward. "What is he doing?" The distance between them was too large to land a punch, but in the next moment, Sunny realized his mistake. It was too late, however. The chain suddenly flew off the hunchback arm and instantly covered the distance between them. Before Sunny could react, it was tightly wrapped around the blade of the midnight shard. Then, Haru's pulled it back with tremendous force. Sunny could either allow himself to be thrown to the floor right in front of the cruel executioner or let go of his sword. He chose the second option. The midnight shard flew far away and fell on the marble floor with a melodious ringing. There was little hope of retrieving it, and Sunny doubted that Haru's was going to give him enough time to dismiss and summon the tachi again. Indeed, almost instantly, the fearsome hunchback was already lunging at him, the iron hammers of his fists ready to break every bone in Sunny's body. "Go die, bastard!" Sunny growled and dashed forward. Dodging a deadly strike, he twisted his body and delivered a ferocious blow of his own. His fist connected to the hunchback's chin, making Haru's reel back. Sunny might have been lean and not as tall as most men, but he wasn't a weak outskirt kid anymore. The power of 900 shadow fragments, each earned in a deadly fight against unimaginable horrors, coursed through his veins. He was much stronger than he looked, strong enough to shatter stones with his bare hands, and yet he wasn't nearly as strong as Haru's. While shaken by the blow to the face, the hunchback didn't look seriously hurt. But his next strike almost made Sunny buckle. For a few short moments, the two of them became entwined in violent, barbarous combat. Using their fists, legs, and even teeth, they did anything in their power to destroy the enemy. Haru's fought with the measured skill of an experienced killer, while Sunny fought with the desperate, feral cunning that his cruel upbringing had taught him. The hunchback was at a dire advantage in that fight. With his tremendous might and much larger weight and reach, all he had to do to win it was to wrestle Sunny to the ground. Knowing that, Sunny had done everything in his power to avoid being grappled. He twisted and moved, dodging the hunchback's large hands and delivering strike after strike. Soon, Haru's was bleeding from a half-dozen cuts on his angular face. Sunny, however, was in much worse shape. The hunchback's fists, and especially that damned chain of his, had left terrible marks on his body. The skin on his forehead was split open, and a stream of blood was flowing down his face. Usually, that would have blinded a person. But both of his eyes were already blind. He was using his shadow to see. How ironic. Still, it was just a matter of time before Sunny made a mistake. And very soon, he did. Sunny was only a fraction of a second late, but it was all Haru's needed to land one of his wide palms on his shoulder. Then, he gripped it with enough strength to make Sunny's bones groan, thus robbing the enemy of his only advantage. Mobility. As Sunny's eyes opened wide, the hunchback grinned. Time to die, little worm. With that, he threw him against the wall, making a net of cracks streak through its stone surface. Hurt and disoriented, Sunny felt something cold and inevitable grip his neck. Looking his victim right in the eyes, Haru squeezed Sunny's neck and smiled. Good. It's good that you can see. Usually they don't. Such a pity. Sunny raised his fist and hit the hunchback in the face, but to no result. He couldn't find the proper purchase or move his torso to deliver a proper blow. Regardless, he tried again, then again, then again. The skin on the face of his strangler split, letting more blood flow, but Haru's just continued smiling, looking at him with fascination. Good. Good. This is so good, so good. Sunny weakly raised his hand again, but lingered, hesitating before trying to hit the hunchback again. With what little air remained in his lungs, he wheezed. Hey, bastard, do you remember how I told you that I didn't want to use a trick to kill you? Haru simply grinned. Well, that was a trick. At the same time, he struck the hunchback in the face again. Knowing that these punches were not strong enough to change anything, Haru's didn't react. But this time, a ghostly blade suddenly appeared in Sunny's hand at the last moment. Unlike normal memories, this one weaved itself from nothing and almost instantaneously. Then, it pierced Haru's temple and sunk deep into his brain, killing him on the spot. The grin froze on the hunchback's lips. His eyes widened, then slowly turned glassy. His terrible grip on Sunny's throat weakened. Then, he crumpled to the ground like a broken mannequin, his empty eyes still open and staring into nothingness. Sunny fell to his knees and drew a hoarse breath. Die, you bastard! Die, die, die! A wicked, furious grin appeared on his face. Die and go keep your lord company in hell! Shaking, he used the wall to stand up and looked at the dead butcher with a strange mix of hatred, triumph, and contempt. After a while he said, Don't want to doesn't mean I won't, you fool.